Good morning. Thanks everyone for coming. We're going to start off today's infrastructure panel with the social impact of water finance. We have Professor Klein who's going to give us a brief keynote, and then we'll introduce the panelists who will then introduce themselves via a mini story about some of their experiences that they've had with water, wastewater, and infrastructure. Professor Klein is a professor at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management for Germany he's a senior adjunct professor here at Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. Michael worked at the World Bank until 2009 from 1982, and he was most recently vice president of financial and private sector development for the World Bank Group. He also worked as chief economist at the International Finance Corporation, and he was also chief economist at Royal Dutch Shell Group and headed the unit for the non-OECD economies. Before joining the World Bank, Michael was active in Amnesty International and served on its German board from 1977 to 1979 and its International Executive Committee from 1979 to 1982. Michael studied in Bonn, New Haven, and Paris, and received his doctorate in economics from Bonn University in Germany. So, would you like to honor us on the stage with your presence?
Yeah, I'll stay down here. I'll honor you from downstairs. Thank you very much, Erica.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, it's intimate enough for me to stand here, right? You here? Okay, good. Yeah, just a little warm-up and stretching exercises for the beginning of the conference. So first of all, it's great to see the conference being organized again. So it's now becoming a little tradition at SAIS to have a little infrastructure conference every year with some topics of interest for discussion, as well as the chance to talk to alumni to see what has happened to them since they decided to get into things like infrastructure and energy, and how do careers unfold and what should one concentrate on. So I hope you all get out of this what you're here for. So the little warm-up that I thought about was one of the questions that I found most interesting when thinking about infrastructure broadly. I'll just take one example, and that is, it is easier today in all countries of Africa, almost all countries of Africa, to get access to cell phones than it is to get access to modern water systems. And the question is, why is that? So normally, is it because governments have not recognized the problems, or is there a lack of plans and government undertakings? No, the world is plastered with plans and master plans for expanding the access to water, etc. That can't be the issue. Competition has something to do with it, but there's a deeper problem. When you look at the prices that are being charged for water compared to telecom prices tend to cover all costs and have enough of a margin in there for a normal profit. And some people actually make a very good business out of it. Whereas in water, as best as we know, worldwide in emerging markets, so that excludes the advanced economies, the best estimates that we have is water prices cover about 30% of cost of a water system. So if you run a business where you get a price that covers only 30% of your total cost, that's an issue, no? And it doesn't matter whether you're private or public, it's not going to work unless there's some tax money coming in to supplement the prices. And as long as taxes flow well, that can work quite nicely. But taxes don't always flow well, as we know, no? Some governments have fiscal constraints. And so whenever that happens, you only need to look at this country here, the future of infrastructure is in doubt, whether it's US roads or the DC metro system or whatever you look at, tax issues and appropriation issues loom large. And if you just think you can solve all of this by letting the citizens decide, you only have to look at California. Say whenever you have a referendum on spending more, they said yes, and whenever you had a referendum on taxing less, they said yes as well. So that's all very nice, so that works for a while, but then one day it doesn't work anymore. And so the core issue to think about, to my mind, when thinking about access to services, is what's the level of prices and how does that interact with the quality of government and the fiscal position of government. And as a default setting, I would say cost-covering prices are one key to having access to services. And then comes the question, why are the water prices so low and the telecom prices relatively high? Why is that? And the ostensible reason for that is that governments used to think that telephones are a luxury and water is a necessity, and people should be supported by having low water prices. But the way it works out is not that way. When prices are high, you get access because people invest and deliver services. When prices are low, you don't get access. And so when you look at the incidence of actual water price subsidies in the world, all the studies that we have show that the people who benefit from water subsidies are the ones with above median incomes, not the poor people, because the ones that benefit are the ones that are connected. Poor people are not connected. And so but poor people also need water, whether they're connected to modern systems or not. So they buy from people like vendors, for example, or go fetch the water in long searches, and they tend to pay a multiple of what richer people pay. So the notion that a low price will actually help poor people overall, I think, is a questionable proposition. Access is a much bigger issue. And finally, not to draw this out too long, one other thing to think about, a lot of people frame the issue as financing something. If it was a financing issue, then what's the problem? We are living in a period of money that is extraordinarily cheap. Interest rates are low, return expectations are low at the moment. And where's the problem with financing? So the issue is, and maybe governments don't have money, they can't finance. And so then some people say, let's go to the private sector and get it from there. But the private sector, once you think about it, they will finance something, but they also want their money back. No? The issue is whether somebody's paying for things, not whether somebody's financing. And the term financing is sometimes used to refer to payment and sometimes refers to financing, and that confuses the issue. So the real thing to think about is payment. And we'll go now into the panel on water, and we'll explore different perspectives on water systems. And with that, I'll
Turn it back.
stop my short introduction here.
Thank you, Professor Klein. The first panelist I'm going to introduce is Edward Pinero. I'd also like to thank the panelists for coming. I think we got really lucky with today's guests, and one of them is a Johns Hopkins alumni, and I would encourage you to talk to all of them at the conclusion. Edwin Pinero has a 38-year career. Mr. Pinero has worked in private and public sectors as a consultant to many clients on sustainability, environmental issues, and energy. Mr. Pinero is now president of the Pinero Group. Yay. And he has many clients in sustainability as well as energy. Until recently, he served as the SVP for sustainability for a private water company called Veolia North America. And he was also liaison to Veolia's worldwide corporate social responsibility and public affairs departments. In this role, Mr. Pinero oversaw all the efforts related to sustainability in regard to outreach, client issues, and internal practices, including water, energy, wastewater, business lines. Mr. Pinero represented Veolia in the CEO Water Mandate, the WBCSD Water Group, and the USBCD Water Synergy Project. He also helped develop and field test the Water Impact Index and the True Cost of Water methodology and tools. He also served in the public sector at both the federal and state levels, addressing sustainability issues. During his service at the White House, he focused on developing and implementing sustainability policy and practices within the U.S. federal government. Mr. Pinero also served in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection as both the director of the Bureau of Environmental Sustainability and held the office of Pennsylvania State Energy Director. So he has a lot of experience, and I know a lot of people here are also interested in energy. Mr. Pinero has been an adjunct professor at, and you'll correct me, Duquesne University and the University of Arizona, and is currently a visiting scholar with George Washington University's Environmental and Energy Management Institute. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Geology from the State University of New York and a Master's of Science degree in Geology from Texas A&M University. He is going to give us a brief about the water issue that happened in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And if you join us on the stage. Thank you.
Stay out of the line of sight. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the nice welcome. And the older you get, the longer your resume gets, and you try to find ways to compress it. So you did a very nice job of covering my whole life in a couple seconds. So that's excellent. Thank you. What I wanted to touch on a little bit here to kind of do my contribution to this discussion is I'm going to talk for the most part from my experiences working with an organization, a company that it was a water services provider, among other things. So we operated water systems for both the public and the private sector. And in that experience, it was the very interesting lessons learned. Some of them were very mechanical and very tangible. Others really were very nuanced. And if you didn't really pick up on the what was going on, it was easy to continue to make mistakes and things like that. So I think what I'd like to share is some of those thoughts. Erica asked me if I would touch on this Cochabamba, Bolivia story as an example, which I will kind of do that a little. I will do that, and maybe sprinkle in another example or two in the couple of minutes here of my introductory comments that illustrates how this can and how this goes and may not go so well, and kind of what were some underlying reasons. If you're not familiar with this story, this happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and fundamentally what happened here was in a somewhat questionable, not so transparent manner, the government of this community sold the water supply utility to a private company to operate, which is not an unusual thing that happens around the world. The idea of transferring utilities from private to public, public to private happens pretty frequently. However, in this case, shortly after the transition, the rates skyrocketed, which resulted in, and the real story here, or made this in the media, wasn't so much that, it was the public reaction to this. There were protests, there were some of them violent. There was at least one fatality as a result of this revolt, essentially. And it really brought to the surface a lot of underlying concerns that were occurring there in terms of corruption and lack of transparency and so on. And the way the story kind of crafted, and I don't want to, the real politics is really not the issue here, although that's what made the news. And that is, the protests and the government sold us out. After a very short period of time, it was from late 1999 to mid 2000, the government came back and took over the utility again, and took it back and essentially kicked out the private company that was there. So that kind of quieted things down for a little while. But then the company sued the government for the money that they were out as a result of the takeover, which caused another round of protests, of which the community won again because they settled out of court and didn't have to pay that big amount of money. But I think the untold story there, which is really kind of gets at this discussion about the cost of things and the financing, and that is, what was not such a success story in the Bolivia case is that where things ended up were pretty similar to where they were in the beginning that prompted the whole transition in the first place. And that is a less than ideal infrastructure and water service. Water is not 24/7. The quality was in question. Many of the people in the community were not even connected to the system. And that's what they were trying to address by virtue of the privatization. So let me just kind of tell you a couple of takeaways from that story, and maybe as part of the discussion, through the moderated part of the discussion, we can talk about some other examples. But I think the big takeaways here, there's a couple of things. One is, in this world of this issue of water use, particularly water utilities, it applies to infrastructure, but water is a very sensitive issue. And that is communication and openness and awareness. One of the challenges wasn't so much, the Bolivia case, it wasn't so much a case of the financial calculations around the decision. It was the lack of transparency and understanding who's doing what and how this is being contracted and so on. So this issue of of communities, communication openness is very important. There's a counterexample to this I'll just put on the table real quick, and that is McKeesport, Pennsylvania, where there was a transfer of the wastewater utility to a private company. Went incredibly smoothly. Why is that? Open communication with the ratepayers. They knew what was going on. There was agreements, very transparent agreements on when rates would change and not change, and so on. So that's a success story in a very similar situation in terms of the transfer. So the second takeaway is it's not, and this is kind of where I land on all this, and that is it's not a binary answer. It's not a case of it's run by the public or it's run by a private organization. There is such a thing called the private-public partnership, that intermediate where you're taking the best of both worlds in terms of what the public component has to offer and what the private sector companies, organizations can bring to the table. And I think you'll hear from the other panelists the role and the value of this private-public partnership. And for us at Veolia, that was a big part of how we did business. We were really the private-public partnership kind of organization. Wasn't so much emphasizing the actual ownership. And the last point, the last takeaway is the issue of the human right to water and sanitation. And people, that's what makes water infrastructure such a sensitive discussion when it's compared to energy and transportation and telecommunications and so on. And that is, there's this inherent feeling that there's a right to water that should not have any cost, let alone a high cost. But the reality of life is access to water, clean water and sanitation has a cost associated with it. So the question is not whether do you get it free or not, is how are you going to pay for it? Either you pay for it directly as a ratepayer kind of relationship, or it's paid by the government, which is really, we're all paying for it through our taxes. So I think we need to think about that when you try to figure out what is the cost, what is the real cost of the infrastructure? Because as Professor Klein mentioned in the beginning, there is a cost involved with this, and if the cost is not recovered, it's an unsustainable business model, and eventually will fail in one way or the other. And I think what happened in Bolivia, to close my points here, what happened in Bolivia, I think, is a realization that they didn't answer that question, and that is the sustainability of the financial model. So they ended up back where they started, which is a less than ideal infrastructure because they were just not able to support that. So the real answer is, how do you leverage innovation? How do you leverage unique business models to result in innovative financing that will allow a sustainable system, yet be fair to the full population? And I think that's the trick on the table in terms of this whole issue of the social impact of water financing.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Finero, for your very informed.
Stay up here, or do you want to go in?
We have an informal group. We have a small group. Would you like to stay up here, or would you like to?
What would you like us to do?
I will let you choose.
Let's go up.
You're gonna come up? Okay. Yeah. Let's go up.
Otherwise, we keep guessing.
So I know that many people here are interested in the international side of things. We do have two guests from Baltimore and DC, and they are domestic panelists. But as Mr. Pinero shared with us, there are many issues that cross international and domestic boundaries, and many lessons, I think, that as we discussed before today, that can be applied to both. So to that end, I'd like to introduce Mr. Brogdon. Here's the reveal. He's the Johns Hopkins alumni. So I will start with the end of your introduction at the beginning. He graduated with a Master's of Business Administration and Finance from Johns Hopkins University, where we have business with humanity in mind. I think this timed out. Thank you. And
that's close to my last name, but not
it's
quite.
close. Did I not
Don't
say
worry
it
about
correctly?
it. Small thing.
Brogdon. Horrible. He was hired the Chief Fiscal Officer for the Department of Public Works in December of 2016. He's a certified public accountant in the state of Maryland and earned, as you already know, his MBA from Johns Hopkins. Mr. Brogdon has nearly 20 years of public service and has served in the areas of accounting, finance, and budget throughout his government career. He's also an active member of the Government Finance Officers and Association of Maryland, Association of Certified Public Accountants. And he's going to give us a little brief on what Baltimore's doing in
Yep.
terms of their new water infrastructure in light of their being in the state of Maryland, which has maybe a little bit different take on how to finance water projects.
I am. Well, first of all, thanks for having me today. And secondly, I'm glad I'm going second because when you hear George speak, you'll just be in awe. So I'm glad I get to sit back and then just listen to him. I'm telling you, he's a dynamic speaker, dynamic person. So I guess the format after this is done, will the audience, is it interactive where questions
It will
and
be
answers?
moderated and then question and answer.
Okay, because I'm an interactive person. I'm kind of on the fly. I go with it. But real quick, I think there's real estate students in the audience? One real estate,
There's 3.
3? Okay, I'm
Yes.
just trying to get the sectors. Real estate, and then there's actually infrastructure? Or what's the other components of the who's in the audience? Energy?
Energy.
Okay, I was trying to tie everything into it. But am I talking affordability or just about infrastructure? Or whatever?
Baltimore's issues with affordability and infrastructure. Make it as brief as possible. These are
Okay,
your
well,
mini
let's start this
introductions.
way. Okay, I can tailor that. So I've been in government for probably the last 20-some years. Before that, I was in private sector. But it wasn't until I started with Public Works that I really understand the cost of water. Before that, it's just one of those situations where I received my water bill and I paid it. But for a certain segment, there's the affordability issue. But again, it wasn't until I started working for Public Works that I see what it took to take that raindrop that came down today, to take it from processing that water to the distribution process, to then taking it from your house or apartment, processing that again as sewage, and then having that go into the bay at a much cleaner, healthier state than the actual bay is. So with that being said, I'm not sure if we all understand the processing of water, the infrastructure involved, and what it takes, but I won't go into that. Maybe that's something interactive if you'd like to know later. But here's what I will say. The actual cost of supplying water to your home involves your reservoirs, your holding tanks. So once it's processed, it involves pumping stations. It involves all the infrastructure underground that you do not see. It involves the customer service division. So when you call and have a complaint about your water bill, they're there to handle that for you. It involves water meters. We underwent a new billing and water meter conversion process at the same time. I think it might have been the first in the country. I'm not sure. I think you all did. I'm not sure if you did both at the same time, but we did that. So there's a cost. So when your water bill, that there's a cost coming in, and then at the same time, there's not the same set of pipes, but another set of pipes that are underground called mains that we have to take that. We have our own wastewater facilities that will process that. It becomes sludge, and then there's actually a cost for us. Again, George will give you a different thing, but we have to pay somebody to actually take that away, right? We haven't had the model where we can maybe turn that into fertilizer or whatever and sell it or whatever, but so there's a cost. So in my category, the way I look at things, there's the operating and maintenance side of everything, and then there's your actual cost of capital. So when we want to do we did Back River, which cost us $400 million. There's no way that the ratepayers can pay that individually in an annual year. So we have to go to the bond market, and so that's the cost of capital. Then what we're doing now is we're looking at other options, such as, there's the WIFIA program, in which the government that's run by or administered by the EPA. It's a new program that started this year that's pretty favorable terms, gives us 35 years, up to 35 years to pay that back. And then there's always cash. So the main thing is when we're looking at infrastructure, and I'm going to tie this back to the actual bill, and this is affordability. The bill is based on all the things that go into actually, again, supporting the water system. And it's my job as the CFO to make sure that that's an optimal bill that's going out that, unlike a business, we're not in it for profit. But we do have to maintain certain cash reserves because when we go to the bond market, those bondholders want to make sure, or they're ensured that, A, not only do we pay back the principal and interest, but that we have a small reserve that's there for when the economic times get a little tight, we can still pay them. You know, they're not worried about if we have to make business decisions of layoffs or cut back on certain things. They want to be ensured that there's a payback that's in the reserves for us. So we don't have a really retained earnings, but in government, there's a reserve. So with that being said, when we open it up for discussion, and I'm kind of throwing a lot of things out here so you can think about it and then present it back to me and I can answer it in a little more detail. But when we talk about affordability, that's the biggest topic that we're faced with now. So affordability, I look at it in a different view than maybe the mayor or others. Affordability is our bill that comes to you. Are you able to afford that based on your consumption? So you almost drive your water bill. Now, with that being said, let me put this out there that the poverty level, I believe, is around 12,000, the national poverty level. Baltimore, 26% of our population falls within that category. And then we have another percentage that falls, that's half of that. So there's a certain segment that's only making $6,000 a year. So affordability, let's look at it again. I'm able to control what I use as far as water, the number of times I wash clothes, how long I take a shower, if I wash dishes as opposed to a dishwasher. I'm able to control my water bill. Now, with that being said, am I willing to participate in the cost that it took to produce that water and that I consumed it? Some people say I need help with that. That's fine. But with that being said, once you do receive a water bill for $30, we have programs that are set up to assist people that can't afford it or have hardships. But when we help you, are you contributing and doing your part? Or are you just saying, thanks for the assistance, Baltimore City, but I'm still not going to pay anything else because I have other needs. And then that's not us for us to decide or prioritize, right? We can't determine what your lifestyle is and your choices are to pay the essential needs of water. Yes, I need that, a roof over my head, and food. But when you have a cable bill that may be $150, when you have a cell phone bill that's X amount of dollars, and your entertainment, if that all falls above your water bill, again, we can't control that. But my job, again, is to make that an optimal water bill based on everything that we need to produce the water, distribute it, and take it away, and to look at the construction needs that supports that. So with that being said, again, I'm going to turn it over to George, who's next. And then when it's time for the Q&A question, I'm quite sure you have a little bit more specific questions, or you will, that I can address them in detail for you.
So thank you, Troy. I already have a million questions.
Okay.
But I'll leave them till lunchtime. Now, our next speaker is George Hawkins. If you haven't heard of him, then maybe you are in energy, not in water. He's a pretty heavy hitter. He's done a lot here in DC, and he has a slightly longer resume than Troy. I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible. Even that probably doesn't do him justice. So give me a moment. I'm going to introduce him, and then I'm going to let him talk about the bond that DC Water has and also about his new company. George Hawkins served recently until last month as CEO and general manager of DC Water. Mr. Hawkins has transformed the agency into an innovative, customer-oriented enterprise, driving a robust innovations program. It sounds like a lot, but that is actually true when you hear him talk about DC Water. DC Water is now focused on customer engagement, vibrant social media, research and development, and product development and licensing. George has also launched DC Waterworks, a program resulting in significant numbers of district residents being hired as contractors on DC Water projects. In addition, the $2.6 billion Clean Rivers project will eliminate nearly 96% of combined sewer and overflows to local waterways. And the authority recently invested $950 million to reduce nutrients to the Chesapeake Bay. George oversaw the launch of a heralded $470 million waste-to-energy program to produce a marketable nutrient and generate 13 megawatts of green power. George has also tripled the program to replace water infrastructure in the district. DC Water has received almost every major award in the industry, including the 2016 U.S. Water Prize for Resource Recovery. George was named a Governing Magazine Public Official of the Year in 2014 and has received numerous leadership awards. George has held executive positions in state and municipal government, environmental and community groups, the U.S. EPA, and he's also an attorney at a private law practice. Mr. Hawkins graduated from Princeton University and Harvard Law School. He teaches environmental law and policy at Princeton. And we are very thankful that you were able to join us this morning.
Good morning. My gosh. I always say that any time I'm introduced and someone's not swearing at me, it's a good day. And Professor, do you have that microphone that you were talking in when you were standing?
Sticking in the back.
This is a reason for this. I want to use that.
Okay.
I'm going to modify my presentation slightly. I'll come back to the
Okay.
Pay for Success. But I think, first of all, it's a delight to be on the program. Known Troy and Ed for a long time. We interacted a lot and deployed Veolia resources at DC Water. And the Baltimore story is very impressive. So I'm pleased to join you. But there's a reason I'm standing down here, because the professor has it exactly right. The water industry does not have a technology problem. There are more technologies out there today about how to do the work of these enterprises than you can shake a stick at. You go to WEFTEC, which is the big conference for our industry on the wastewater side, although I always call it enriched water. I'll come back to that. Is the trade floor is the size of 2 football fields, filled with tech firms. It is not a technology problem. It is not. It is a problem of revenue. If we have the money to do the service, we can do extraordinary things. But to me, that is a question of communication first and foremost, and that's why I'm standing down here. I'll come back to that. And it's an interesting story as to why I was hired at DC Water in the first place. It was 2009. I ran the District Department of Environment, which is the environmental agency for the city, and energy, by the way. We had energy in that office. And I'm an environmental lawyer, so I know how to do that. I've been a regulator. I've been an EPA enforcement lawyer. I've been a private sector lawyer, and Mayor Fenty at the time wanted me to go to DC WASA, as we used to be known. Some of you may remember the WASA days. I didn't like WASA. In fact, nobody liked WASA. WASA was the least liked government agency in Washington, D.C., which is saying something. And I thought it was a crazy idea at first. And why would they pick me? Not pick me, the mayor couldn't appoint me. DC Water is an independent authority. The board selects the GM, not the mayor. Although the mayor has influence, it is not a mayoral appointee. And it was because the board, I give the board all the credit for this. They understood that DC WASA's problem was not engineering. It wasn't having good finance people. It was a manner that it had a terrible relationship with the people people served, the government bodies it reported to. And without those relationships, nothing else works. So for a moment, I'm going to start there. You're right. This is not a question of anything other than revenue. And just to give you the end of the story at the beginning, when I arrived in 2009, an all-in single-family bill for DC Water, WASA, as we were known at the time, was $42. Today, it is $110. Every single rate increase I have sought over the years at DC Water, we have gained every single one. The first one, my first year, was 18%. But that hasn't happened by accident. And the reason I'm standing down here is because you can see, and it's not that there isn't plenty of podiums, but when someone's down at this level talking to you at iSpace, it's a completely different relationship with an audience. I've done 72 rate hearings at DC Water. I do them all myself, did them all myself. We go into every ward of the city. We invite anybody who has contacted us for any reason in our database and invite them to come visit with me. And then around the edge of the room, we wouldn't use this room because it's not big enough, but around the edge of the room, we brought every single office at DC Water. Personnel, contracts, water quality, wastewater, everything, they're all there. This is in comparison to the way we did it in the old days, which would have been a centralized office, somewhere that almost no one knows where it was. There'd be 2 rate hearings, formally noticed, so yes, we covered our procedural rules, and like 10 people would show up. No, we went to churches, schools, libraries, in your neighborhood, with the council member from the ward, packed rooms, because when you invite anybody who's contacted you for the last 2 years, people don't call us to say, hey, everything was great today. They only call us when there's a problem. So we're inviting anybody who's had a problem with us to come tell me. And then I give a presentation to them like this, on the floor, on my feet, standing in front of them. You got a question. And all of this is thought out, by the way. So if you ask me a question about something, I'll slowly start walking towards you, not aggressively, but I do that on purpose. And then I'll stand there and look because I need to hear. I need to make a connection, no matter how mad that person is. They're mad. That's already true. So it can't get worse than that unless I treat them poorly. But it might be that if I answer your question well, or I point you to someone in the room when the goal was I'm going to answer you now, someone in the room is going to ask you tonight, or we're going to respond within 24 hours, we'll get you an answer, that relationship has changed. And for someone out there who, when they're mad and have no one to talk to, or it's a distant bureaucracy that they don't understand, they're going to talk to their neighbors and tell them how they're mad. They're going to talk to everyone else, and it's just going to reverberate in this negative sense of what an enterprise is, as opposed to, I didn't totally like the answer, I didn't get it, but he was right there in front of me, his team was there, they answered as best they can, they responded quickly. This is an organization I can deal with. They're people. It is easy to be mad at a distant, bureaucratic organization. You can be mad at me, but I'm standing in front of you. I'm in your church. What can I do? My folks are here. We'll come tomorrow. We'll come to your house. We're human beings trying to do the best job we can given the resources. Now, why do I say all that? The issue here is exactly as it was described at the onset. Can we gain revenue for a service that people think they should get for free, like air? Water isn't like power or anything else. I need it to live. I don't have to pay for air. Why should I have to pay for water? Where I ultimately came from the oceans quadrillion years ago. This is something I shouldn't have to pay for. And I always say, well, in fact, you don't. We don't pay a dime for the water coming off the Potomac. It's free to us. Maybe someday that'll change. Out in the West, it's sometime different. Here, that water's free. But the minute it hits a pipe, there's a cost associated with it. My job is to explain to you what those costs are and why they matter to you. There are all sorts of reviews that say people don't want to pay more for water. And I always get asked about that, and there's always publicity. I'm like, of course not. If someone had called you on the phone and said, do you want to pay more for a hamburger? What would your answer be? No. Do you want to pay more for coffee? No. Want to pay more for the shoes? No. Of course someone's going to not say, yes, I want to pay more for something, unless they know why. We have to make a value proposition at a human level to the people we serve so that they understand what they're paying for. And my experience is when people get it, which is our responsibility, not theirs, they will in fact step up. And that's what we've seen in D.C. D.C. Water's gone from a $250 million a year capital budget to over $600 million a year. We have invested enormous sums. We have permanent funding for water infrastructure replacement. We are taking all the sludge that we pull out of this and turning it into power and a reusable nutrient based on a discretionary investment of almost $500 million that our ratepayers supported because they understood why it mattered to them. Now I'm going to get to actually what you asked me for, and then I'll stop. So the question then becomes, so you make a good case to your customer in every way you can. DC Water's Twitter, by the way, I'm George Hawkins DC in my Twitter account. You follow me, I'll follow you back. GeorgeHawkins.net is my blog. I've written a lot about all the things over the years. So there's a lot of material there about innovations, energy, water nexus, creativity, how to run a program in a public agency that has incentives and all the rest. That's all there if you're curious. But the issue to me is brought home when I have a customer, which happened a lot, and it was painful, personally painful. And it was mainly seniors, actually, who would come up to me in a rate hearing just like this, in rooms bigger than this, but same idea. And I'll never forget one in particular. It's just blazed in my memory. It was Ward 5, which is a northeastern part of the city, and she came up, and she was an older woman. She goes, I get what you're saying. I support what you're doing. I'm on a fixed income. And my bill for water's gone from $40 to $90, which I'm struggling to pay. But since I'm a fixed income, I've got to cut some other thing that I'm spending money on to spend money more here, and I just don't have any more. And it's not that I don't support you. It's not that you haven't made the value proposition that you are seeking. She didn't say it in those words, but she's saying, I hear you, I just don't have any more money. I'm sure you hear that all the time in Baltimore. So even when you make your value proposition in a form that they understand, in a way that's accessible to your customers, you're going to have customers that can't pay. So then you have to adopt a whole range of innovative finance. Then financing does become the issue. When you've made a good claim and you have customers who are willing to pay, but you've got absolute affordability problems inhibiting, what kills a utility's ability to raise rates on the people who can pay is when the people who can't become a political force against it. You saw that picture. What are you going to do when you're a public official and you've got people on the streets throwing rocks at you like you're evil? And if you go to a public hearing and you have this older woman who is a nice person and someone everybody's heart goes out to saying, I just can't pay this bill, that kills your capacity to raise the rates on the people who can pay the bill. So then it's a financing question. How can we create a financial structure when we've made a value proposition that handles a low-income, fixed-income challenge while raising rates on everybody else and making the case and all the rest? That's one piece of it. I will just summarize what we did at DC Water, because I'd then blab on for too long if I didn't otherwise. And you heard it already from Baltimore. First, cover your lowest income citizens. It's the right thing to do morally. It is also the right thing to do for a business model. And it is very nice when those two things line up. So at DC Water, if you are below the low-income trigger to get energy assistance, so it's already an established program. By the way, this is also cheap because we didn't have to figure any of that out. The energy offices in these cities already have a schedule put out by the Department of Energy for low-income assistance for energy. So we just used the same schedule. And by the way, the same process. We had no transaction fees. Once you satisfied the obligations for that other program at their cost, we just got the list. And if you're on the list, boom, you get a subsidy for over half of your bill. It's called the CAP program, Customer Assistance Program. And it's paid for by the other customers in your rate base. So all the people who can pay, it's a very small amount, contribute to subsidize the bills for the lowest income customers. And in all the rate hearings I've done, like I said, there's been more than 70 of them, I've never had a ratepayer question that program, ever. Even though all the rest of the ratepayers are paying a little bit more to subsidize the really poorest of your customers, never have I had anyone question that goal, because it's so compelling. It's the right thing to do. Those people now have support, and now you've eliminated on a business model the biggest drag on your ability to raise funds from everyone else. Then there was the fixed income senior. How am I going to handle that group? Well, at DC Water, we created something called the lifeline rate. Think about a single or even two, a couple seniors. A lot of these were individuals living by themselves as they have very low water use. So if you create a rate that for a certain percentage of water use you pay less, those folks will be under that level. It's like a tax rate. They'll be only using less amount. They don't use lots of water when they're a senior living on their own. Their bill went down. So once again, we created a program that seemed right to us. It was a very small amount of money that we lost in revenue, and we took out the other biggest reason why we couldn't raise rates on everybody else. We did a lot of fixed rate structure. If you use no water or a lot of water, there's still pieces of our system we have to pay money into that has to be there. That's not a cost based on variable use. So we have a lot of fixed costs on our bill fixed revenue because we have fixed costs. So you help pay to those regardless. That's tough to do, but we explain it to our ratepayers. Last but not least is that every kind of financing you do, and your customers like this in my experience, even if it's not directly, the environmental impact bond was one. DC Water did a century bond. We did a low denomination bond. We did all sorts of things, and part of it was to tell the story to our ratepayers, anything we can think of that will benefit the financial picture of this enterprise and you as a ratepayer, we will do or explore. Century bond was one of your, 100-year maturity bond, never done by a water utility before. We did it. And actually got more buyers for that bond than we expected. Interest rates dropped, saved our ratepayers almost $10 million. The next one was the environmental impact bond. And I'll just briefly summarize it, then I'll stop talking so much and we can get to the interactive part, which is always the best part. I wanted to install green infrastructure in the city to handle stormwater. And the plan we had in place was all deep tunnels, which we are building. The green infrastructure to me is the right thing to do. I'm an environmental guy originally, but think of the other things green infrastructure does. It's at the surface. It's right out on the street. The people who do that work you can hire from the neighborhood where the work is being done. You're building allies with green infrastructure and benefits and friends that hidden infrastructure and deep tunnels do not get you. Deep tunnels are built by the sandhogs that go from tunnel to tunnel worldwide. Green infrastructure is built by your neighbor in your street on something that you can see, realize, and feel. Plus it has air quality benefits and all the rest. So the question was, how are we going to finance it? The difficulty with green infrastructure is you don't know if it works like a pipe does. You put in a big pipe, I can tell you, well, not me, because I'm a lawyer, but my team could tell you exactly how much stormwater that pipe will hold by its diameter and length and some pi, I don't know, whatever all that is. But someone will know precisely how it works, and it's easy to maintain. Green infrastructure, well, it depends how much it's rained, and is it being cleaned? It's all sorts of variables. So everyone's worried, well, if you do the green infrastructure, it might not deliver on the job. So we created a bond for green infrastructure that if it does not work, we get paid back a premium by the investors. Why did the investors invest in it? Goldman Sachs and the Calvert Foundation. That's the Goldman Sachs charitable arm and municipal arm, because they want green infrastructure for cities. So they're doing it because they have a social desire independent of making money. And there's a lot of social impact investors now. So that's why they invested. If we're worried about not performance, they said, well, we'll cover that. If there's low performance, we'll pay you a fee. Now, we don't want low performance, so we will not seek to get that extra fee. And what we paid for to get that is if green infrastructure functions much better than we expect, we pay them a fee. They get a bonus. And that's okay by us too, because if green infrastructure performs really well, that means it's capturing more stormwater than we expected, and that means we have to build less of it to get the same outcome, which means we'll save money. So we're willing to share that with the investor. But it's just one more story of how we were able to get an outcome which connected to our ratepayers at the level of their community and took care of the risk and could tell the story, we're doing everything in our power to be creative and innovative to benefit you, and that will never stop. And that is part of the manner in which you can get sustainable finance and then ultimately a sustainable operation in a water utility. So I'll stop talking now, and thank you. That was
great. I think that's just actually also a little tiny part of what you've done. So with that, I will turn it over to, I'll take the microphone, and I'll turn it over to Professor Klein.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your contributions. Let me start off with two questions, and we'll go to the audience. In the last stuff that you laid out, George, you were talking about subsidy schemes, lifeline rates, means-tested systems where you piggybacked on the energy people. Mm-hmm. What about picking up on a point that Troy made earlier? Said for Troy, the customer situation not only includes how much they pay for energy, for water, but also for the cable bill. So overall, they have expenditures. Would it be a better idea to just give cash transfers to people overall, let them decide how much they pay on water and energy and cable, et cetera? Or is it better to have subsidies that are focused on the particular services that you might be involved with, water or energy? Do you have views on that?
Okay. There's a government employee view, as a business person's view. But let me say this. So if I'm hearing you right, if we gave, you're saying cash right to the resident versus actually paying it to Public Works to offset their bill?
Yeah, at the moment, there's some mechanism by which somebody who buys water and says, I'm needy, I'm poor, you give them a subsidy of some form.
Okay.
And then the Energy Office has another system, and they also have an approach like that. But overall, whether people can live within their means or not depends not only on what they spend on water and energy, but also on the other things. You mentioned cable
Yeah.
bills,
I-
et cetera.
it-
So
so-
if the city had a system which says every poor people below 6,000 a year, or whatever the number might be that you choose, will get an overall cash amount from the city. And then they can decide whether they want to buy a lot of water or
Okay, so
cable TV.
let me, I have several views. One, Baltimore City, we're utility, regional utility. We receive, as far as the water and wastewater, we don't receive any general funds. So we survive on whatever we collect from our residents. Now, solid waste, we get some general funds, but that's a different story. That's trash collection, landfills, and all that good stuff. So with that being said, and this is public knowledge, it's in our financial statements, we have over a $40 million accounts receivable, which means even those who can pay aren't paying the full bill. So we're dealing with several things. How do we as a city support the residents who can't afford it? And then what's the encouragement for those who can afford it, but there's still a little reluctance or whatever to have them pay timely? $40 million. We could do a lot with 40. We could leverage a lot of financing. We could not slow it, but there's a lot of benefits to receiving that $40 million. But I guess my thing is, if a person is going to receive a certain dollar amount from the city that's already factored into our financial model, would they be encouraged to then still pay the bill? So if your bill's $100 and we allocate 20 to you, are you encouraged to pay the other 80? Or do you say, well, they paid 20, I'm good, they'll pay 20 next month, and I'm taken care of? Or would it be better, if you pay the 20, we'll match your $20. So now there's 40, or something, or a hybrid. So it's kind of, I'm not sure, if, in my opinion, that giving them the actual cash is going to help, because it's already built into the system. And Baltimore currently has four programs: the Senior Citizen Low-Income Assistance Program, a hardship program, a low-income water assistance program, and a payment plan. With that, the participation rate in all of those are not where we want them, but we have a heavy campaign where we do reach out to the residents to promote these initiatives. So it's kind of, we're here to help. We still have to supply you with water. There were some other things previously that related to tax sales. If you didn't pay your water bill, your houses were subject to tax sales. The new mayor said that's no longer, we're not doing that. If it's just related to water liens only, you won't lose your house for that. But with that being said, we are now implementing the turn-off program, which says if you're behind so many months, so much in the dollar amount, we will come and turn your water off. But with that, because then you also face variables, I'm gonna wrap it up, that senior citizens, if you have a health issue, if you have kids in your home, a litany of things can be brought to us that says, I must still receive my water from you all, even though I'm not paying, so.
My sense is that, and I don't ever want to be the person that rains on a new idea just because it's new, but if we were giving, if the city, we're separate from the city, so the city would never give anything to anybody that came back to us. Our finances are very independent. The advantage of the system we run is that our future is in our own hands. And we can plan, therefore. Our financial plan and our capital plan is a decade. And when you're planning big water infrastructure projects, you're always planning 5-6 years out. And we want to have pretty certain revenue projections to know what we can build into the plan. And I'd be nervous if it were a question of giving a low-income customer X amount of dollars and then seeing how they allocated it, of the uncertainty of all that. It's an interesting question. I haven't really thought a lot about it, so I'd be totally welcome. I'm always interested in what might work better. If it's better than what we got, I have no problem changing it. On the low-income question, we do shut off in DC. We're pretty tough on our customers if they don't pay us. One thing I was never but turning off someone ultimately from water is at the last part of 20 steps. I mean, you do everything in your power not to turn off somebody's water. Something I never did finally implement, although I always wanted to, and I'm hopeful that DC Water's still looking at it, because I've heard about this, I just haven't field tested it. I understand that there is a water limiter that you can put on a connection to a home that allows enough water through so that they'll have enough to brush their teeth and cook. So it's not a good life. It's not a strong shower. You flush the toilet 3 times a day, not 30 times a day. But it is not zero. Because I think the issue of turning off water is that they will still get water. A home needs this resource, so they'll go find it somewhere. So either they're going to connect in illegally, or they'll be buying it at a higher cost, which will be even harder on them than our own bill. So it just seems crazy to me, even though we do it, because that is the business model. You don't pay us, ultimately there is a challenge to you. But if you could have water limiters put in the shutoff, it does mean rolling a truck, because we can turn off meters now electronically, which is cheaper, but rolling a truck, putting in a water limiter so you can survive. It's not a happy life, because there's nowhere near as much water as you'd want to have, but it's enough to cook, and that's what I would prefer. That we never actually turn anybody off from water 100%. It's not a good thing that you're not paying your bill, because you'll be in a very tough day-to-day life, but it won't be life-threatening. And just throw that out there, because we have not done that at DC Water, but I was always interested in always covering that human dimension angle on the front.
Just a comment on this whole set of questions from to kind of give an international perspective on the situation, because here in developed countries, and particularly in North America, there's an expectation that the infrastructure will provide. So you're dealing with those issues in terms of maintaining that. And sometimes when you're working in developing countries, and at Veolia we operated in 40 different countries of all different types, when there's no infrastructure, it's a whole different challenge. So just to comment on this issue of how do people get the money, one of the things that we learned, and it's not a secret, is that philanthropy is not sustainable, ironically, especially if you're talking about a need for a sustained service as compared to a once and done thing. I'll go in, build it, there it is, and everybody, we're fine. You can, unfortunately, you can find thousands and thousands of community water systems and community wells that are drilled that are abandoned in some countries because there's no infrastructure. There was no mechanism designed to make it keep going. So one of the experiments we tried in some of the sub-Saharan African countries was, rather than going in and building water systems on a philanthropy approach, we would go in and build a water system and at the same time try and implement and put in other businesses that people could work, generate income to then pay the bill that supported the system. So whether that was a micro business on recycling materials into sellable goods, or depending on the situation. So what we were doing was, we'll put in a water system and you're going to pay for it, but we're also going to facilitate the generating income by virtue of trying to stand up economies. So that's just a specific point on that. The other thing, and George really hit this on in his last example of something he would like to see, really gets at the core of what does it mean to have the human right to water. There's 2 ways to look at it. Human right to water means I should get as much water as I want at no cost because it's water. The other side is, if what you're talking about is an inherent human need for water to survive, that amount is different. And what do you do with the differential between here's what you need to have to live to survive, that inherent need for water, and here is what you want for other things. I was in San Francisco during the height of their drought, and there was one of those put on the side of the road lighted signs that kind of have temporary messages, and in the throes of the drought, the challenge to the community was, we're in a drought, we got to save water, only wash your car once a week, or alternate how many days are you watering the lawn. And to me, that was, you look at that and you say, okay, that's one challenge. You have Cape Town, you had Sao Paulo, that it was a question of, is anything going to come out of the faucet when I open the spigot? We did a project at Veolia in Nagpur, India, where the big news was that now there was clean water getting to some neighborhoods 24/7. And to us, that's, well, of course, I'm going to get water 24/7 and clean water. And if you don't, I'm going to raise hell. So it's really interesting how these dynamics have to work, but they all come back to the exact same point that Professor Klein made and that George reiterated, and that is, it's not a technology issue, it's a revenue issue. And combined with that, I would add, it's a psychology issue. It's people have to understand and be aware of this issue. So it's awareness to support the understanding that it's a revenue issue, because that's the reality of life.
As one engineer from your formerly named company, before Veolia was Compagnie Générale des Eaux, no? One of the engineers said, God gave us water for free, but he forgot to lay the pipes. No? So that gives rise to that problem. No? What I hear you saying is two things. One is if you just give cash to people instead of in-kind subsidies based on the service, they might like that. But at the end of the day, they might still come to you and say, I don't have enough, I can't pay you. And use the same political dynamic that you described and how to deal with in communications to not pay. The second thing I sort of heard you also say is we don't want to get into the tax appropriation issues. We want to be independent. We want to have our own source of revenue so that we don't get hung up in politics where we get bogged down like DC Metro in whether we have enough money for maintenance, et cetera. That's correct, those two arguments I heard? And let me ask one more question to that and then your answer.
Okay.
We always talk about the people not paying being poor people. We went once on a collection mission in Guinea-Conakry for electricity company, et cetera, and then come to the house of a military officer and he comes out with a gun and says, I'm not paying. And so that drives home the case that people who don't pay in most countries tend to be the governments and the military in particular. So is there something like that going on here as well, or is that not an issue at all in your experience? But you had also another point.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on Edwin's,
Ed's fine.
okay, Ed, on Ed's point, that is it's a bit of psychology to it. It's a mental approach because being the CFO and from Baltimore, I have family that's in Baltimore. So when they talk to you about the water bills, they have some of the same concerns that everybody else has. And so I asked them, do you ask if you go to a car wash, do you ask them for a discount on the car wash? Right? You're using water services. When you go to the store, Walmart, wherever, and pay for your bottled water, are you looking for discounts? Do you pay full price? When you go use any other services, laundromat or whatever, there's a service that's there that they're providing water services to you. But because it's a government service, you and I think you touched on it, you feel that it should be, if not free, a cheaper service because the government is providing. But it's still almost run as a business. There's all the components. If there was a P3 model or a private company were running that, they'd have to make the same decisions based on the amount of revenue that comes in based on your customer base. So, but I had that, Thanksgiving, Christmas, they want to drag me into a room and talk about water bills. However, it's, they will still pay retail or whatever the price is for other water services that's outside the government realm. So I just want, it's definitely a psychological component to it as well.
Any powerful people not paying you on?
We're pretty ruthless with them. So the answer is yes. We have all sorts of customers that for whatever reason don't pay. And I feel badly for those who are truly low income, or someone doesn't pay and they can pay, we will cut them off. We will put a tax lien on their property. We go to court all the time. Because I am so sensitive and aware of the people who truly have a problem paying, those who aren't paying that don't infuriate me. And if there's something we haven't done, or so if they call up and here's why, we'll fix it. If there's a problem that has triggered you not wanting to pay, and any part of that problem is on our side, we'll fix it. I got no problem with that. But if you're just not paying, and it does happen, We have a forceful, multifaceted, and relentless response.
And is it more difficult in the US to get money out of government bureaucracies to pay than it is out of
I haven't
individuals?
had that trouble.
Okay.
Because we're, like I said, we are independent. I think we have, I personally like the independent authority model.
I would love to experience that.
Because
Absolutely.
I have been a mayoral appointee and I know that world. And I very much please every political person I can think of, if I can. Those relationships are vital to our success. But our finances are our own. We're AAA credit rated muni, which is extremely rare. That's our own. And the mayor cannot change my budget. The DC council cannot change, not my budget anymore. DC Water's budget. We have to present it. We take all the grief. And actually, the advantage to the mayor and the council is that when we raise rates, they can say, I had nothing to do with it. That was them. So we actually give the political folks the cover. And if you got a problem with it, you're right, it is us, and I'll come to your church and all the rest. The last comment I'll make, just because there's energy people in the room, the other component that I think is vital for a public agency, and this is what's unusual, but it's the opportunity that you all face as you study and decide what to do with your career, whether it's power or water. The advantage of water is it's an industry that will not change. It will change in its components, but there will be water delivery and water treatment forever. So it's a great industry to be in, and it's everywhere at some level or another, even if it's woefully inefficient or non-existent. So it's unfortunately, mostly women carrying on their shoulders. There's still a water system there, and there always will be. The opportunity to be creative in water is incredible, and that's what I had not been prepared for when I started, but it's also part of this picture. The energy project we did for $470 million, we did because it's cash flow positive. More water is used in the United States for the production of power than is delivered to residential customers. And the water sector is one of the largest customer base. DC Water is the largest customer for Pepco because of how much power it takes to push water around. Carry a gallon of water, see how heavy it is? We're moving 100 million gallons of water around the city every day and 350 million gallons of enriched water around the city every day. So we're a huge power user. That gives enormous opportunity to create innovative financing, not only finances, products and services. So we have 12 patents now at DC Water with 6 more on the way. We are licensing and selling services and products. That revenue is going back into the agency. What I tell my ratepayers, what I used to tell my ratepayers, is you invested in us. The fact that we are able to do these things is only because you invested your rate money in us. But now that we're good at something, we've been able to figure out a technology and patent it and sell it on the market, you get that payback, just like a shareholder would or a private investor would. If we were investor-owned, you're our shareholders. So if we can sell those services on the market, if we can do a project that saves energy, you go down to the ballpark and watch a baseball game this summer, look to your left, there's a brand new headquarters for DC Water right on the Anacostia. The water, the heating and cooling in that building is done from sewer thermal, the first installation of its kind, second in the United States. That was an innovation brought to us by a 27-year-old engineer. And now we're going to go into business offering heating and cooling to buildings around the city from sewers. Revenue source already exists, really cool. The landlords love it because it takes the HVA systems that are on their roofs, those big ugly things they got, you take that off, they get their roof back for a deck. What does everybody want in DC? A deck on the roof, because there's you can see the whole city because there's the height limitation on buildings. That's an example of paying our ratepayers back for the investment they've made in us. And what I've been astonished by is the level of creativity that we found in our organizations that make that possible. And that's really fun to be part of.
Edwin, any comments? Veolia getting paid by everybody?
No. Now, especially in North America, a lot of Veolia's business is as a service provider and operator. We don't own the systems. Mainly, we do these private-public partnerships where it's a public system. The rates are set by the community. It's owned by the community, but Veolia runs the system. So when the bills go out, in some cases, we have part of our contract includes sending out the billing and managing the billing. When somebody doesn't pay, we have to turn to the utility ownership to kind of for guidance in terms of what are the rules to deal with this. Can I add a comment on this issue? One of the things is, and then we'll go to the questions. When you talk about getting enough resources and funding to do this, if you think about the money that's available in a given area as a pie, everybody gets a little piece of this pie, and if you want to get a bigger piece of the pie, you have to eat into somebody else's piece, or make the pie bigger. And I think when we talk about innovative financing, the green bonds and and you look at the private-public partnerships and leveraging the skill sets of these organizations or whatever, what you're doing there is you're starting to expand the pie so that there's more resources available to put towards something in a way that starts to partially offset some of these limitations you have because of how much you can actually collect. Veolia had a contract with the city of New York it was a performance-based contract, which meant it had nothing to do with running a facility. It was more looking at the system as a whole. And what the contract structure is we would identify opportunities for efficiency improvement that would the net will improve the performance of the system. But the cost to kind of go through that exercise was already prohibitive because that was an additional cost. So the way the contract was structured was the analysis to come up with the improvements would be done at cost or a loss, on the condition that if you implement the identified efficiencies and you realize the savings that were projected, we share those savings. So that way everybody had a little interest in the game because it was in our best interest to come up with good ideas because otherwise we wouldn't get that performance share. And plus we lose the initial investment. It was in the city's best interest because they've got improved system, an improvement to the system without having to front that cost or whatever. So the first phase of the work in New York led to $110 million savings as a result of these improvements. And that was shared around for all the players. And it was one of the few times that the city did not have to raise rates, although they implemented improvements. So that was a win-win for everybody. The trick to this is we have to get away from paying for the gallon of water we use to start to pay for the next gallon. I think that's part of the challenge, and that is, how do you build in revenue now that pays for the next gallon? Otherwise, you're constantly going to be fighting up against deteriorating infrastructure. There's no way around it.
With that, let's open for questions.
Hi, my name is Jordan DeGroat. I'm actually an alien here. I'm from Georgetown. I came over because I saw it on Facebook. So my question is regarding the increasing development in a water commodities market. In recent years, in Australia, I think there's the groundwork for a water exchange. And in general, there's growing interest in investment in water as a speculative commodity. I was wondering as to what your ideas were on this idea and whether or not that could be a sustainable plan for a city to purchase water futures to kind of secure that next gallon. Thank you.
I would say, excuse me, from my point of view, today it rained. That supplies our water. In a drought, we pull from the Susquehanna River. That supplies our water. So I'm not sure. I turn it over to my panelists with me if, as far as futures in the water supply, if that's what you're saying.
I have been doing a lot of these kinds of programs for years, and a lot of my colleagues in the water utility world always ask me why. And one of my answers is every time I do one of these programs, I hear something I had not thought of before, which is good for me. I like it. I have never thought of a water commodity system. I can think of 10 problems with it right out of the gate, but again, I don't want to be opposed to things just because they're new. Water is a commodity, and buying and selling futures, boy, it's brutal out there in areas that are water scarce. We sort of do that, and I can't remember if Baltimore was part of it, but all the big water utilities here did something like that, but very practically. We built reservoirs that, in fact, we don't need in any that are upstream of us. And that's our water future. So all of us banded together, bought 2 different reservoirs that were expensive to build. We might do a third in an old rock quarry. So it's sort of that. We're ensuring against future need by by purchasing future sources that we then own. So each of the utilities that contribute to that owns a percentage of the water in that reservoir. And if it's needed, it's released into the Potomac, which then flows downstream, and we take it off the Potomac. So it's also natural. It's a system that doesn't use pipes to get it to us. It comes through the natural scheme, which is good on an environmental basis. The notion of buying, selling water futures, I just haven't thought about it enough. It's an intriguing idea. My guess is that's something for a water scarce market, at least at first, which is mostly west, southeast. We have been blessed in the short run anyways to be in a relatively water-rich area here, like Great Lakes. So I would think it'd be harder. Scarcity is what would create that kind of demand and value. But it's a very interesting concept. I would have to think more about it and hear more about anywhere that it's been done.
And actually, it's those kind of ideas that will help prompt this issue of innovative ways to kind of get the financing. There's a saying in the water business that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And out west, if you look at the water rights issues and the Colorado River allocations and all that kind of stuff, what happens, and I don't want to be a party pooper on that either, because I think those are great ideas. And I think we wouldn't be where we are now even if it wasn't because some great idea came up that sounded really, well, that sounds kind of odd, but it worked. So stick with it. But in water, what happens sometimes in these markets is the default is the community. And understandably so, because again, this inherent right to water. So even if you feel that you have a right to a certain volume of water, if scarcity issues start to hit, what happens is the first to go, the default is we're always going to make sure we have water for the community. And if that means shutting your access down if you're a company in the area, if that means shutting access to water to a power plant or whatever, well, everything gets progressively shut down, even if they had the right to it or the ownership right to it in a crisis situation. So that'll, unlike other commodity markets, that one's going to have to be balanced a little bit between what are the thresholds. And in the West is a good example. In the Colorado River allocation, when things start to go bad, and we see like Lake Mead, for example, is so incredibly low, they start talking about, you're not going to get your full allocation because of this, so and so, and that's a case of, but I own it. It's on the contract. It doesn't matter. There's no water, and unfortunately, the way this thing was structured, you're the first to go. So, good luck. So this will have to kind of be worked out, but it's an interesting market approach to the idea.
But, yeah, I'm always curious just to learn, in what context did you, if you had a business model or you're starting your own company, what?
So I first came across the idea doing research for the government of Antigua and Barbuda, who perennially in a drought, and after the recent hurricane and in general the rising sea levels have serious risks to their limited freshwater supplies. And the idea was that because they don't have the ability to just build an extra reservoir or something along those lines, that if they could somehow secure a futures contract on the price of water in 10 years or something, then they could be in a position similar to Southwest buying oil futures before the jump in oil prices, where they would be in a position where they have the ability to provide water to the residents, or they have the ability to cash out on equity in their investment. And either way, they're in a better position than they were before.
Okay.
Can I just a few comments on that? You mentioned Australia. That's the one market in the southwest of Australia which sort of works like a market. Then you have the quasi-markets in the southwest of the U.S., and you have Chile. Chile have water rights and to some level of markets. The Antigua, the standard response of everybody is first, let's get another water source. The biggest example at the moment is China. The north is water scarce, the south is water rich. You build tons of pipelines from the south to the north. Very expensive way of doing it, but everybody gets water. The next approach, if you can't do that, is to shut people off, or to make them wash their cars less often and water the lawns less often, or fill the swimming pool only once every 2 years, and stuff like that. And then when it gets really scarce, and then the question is whether you use a pricing mechanism to deal with this. But the kind of stuff, thinking about this may slowly come over time, but in my lifetime, I will not see Antigua or Barbuda get a forward contract to lock the water price in for them in the future. For that to be able to happen, you have to have an underlying water trade, in this case by ship, that you can overlay with futures contracts, et cetera. And this doesn't exist. There is a very minimum amount of ship-based water trade. Libya used to import water by ship from Spain, for example, when they had scarcity under Gaddafi. But that's not a market. That's an occasional one-off thing that happened. So as a practical policy proposal for people at the moment, no. But for water scarce systems to think about, shouldn't we use a price-based mechanism and possibly based on water trading rights ultimately to allocate scarcity rather than having quantitative decisions that are ad hoc and may not reflect the actual costs and benefits? That's a big deal. And the biggest, what is that? How many pounds do these gorilla have that are in the room?
800 pounds.
The 800-pound gorilla in this case is agriculture, no? It's actually not water, not pools watering the lawn, etc. Agriculture is the one that uses water worldwide at very low prices, and dealing with that will be the biggest single issue.
But the good news to your thought is there's a spinoff to it that you're going to be very successful. And I have a rare last name, so we can, I won't be with the government forever. So
He's from Georgetown, so.
right down the street.
With that, I have to go.
Have a great day.
Hello, my name is Jamaica Harris. I'm actually from AAP. My question is for rural communities. I'm actually from South Carolina, and we actually pay one of the highest rates in utilities. You can have a trailer that pays like $200-300 in electricity and water, and you also have in certain areas brown water days where they keep telling the community that the water is fine. And so when you talk about cities or international markets, it's understandable, but we have issues here, and I know you hear that a lot. But it's like in South Carolina, a lot of things are not getting solved with different issues, and you're asking a community that's already paying $200 and $300, and they can't actually afford it, and say invest more, or we need this money for this, and these communities still have brown water. So what can be done in those areas? That's my question.
I don't have an answer, but I have a finding. We when I was at Veolia, we commissioned Columbia University, the Water Center at Columbia University, to do an analysis of why rates are the way they are around the country and kind of what drives it. And intuitively, we already knew this, but we were able to demonstrate that you get to a minimum point where below which, if you have less than a certain amount of available ratepayers, if it's a rural community, the numbers get so high in terms of the rates because there's a certain minimum cost of running a utility that below which, if you have less than that magic number of residents, they have to make up that slack. And I think what happens in these rural so one of the answers that was explored in that situation is there a way to aggregate regionally some of these utilities so that it balances that out a little bit, so that you don't have the thousands and thousands of little tiny water service providers that only cover such a small community that they got to charge so much, and or not be able to provide the reliable service either in quantity or quality. And I don't.
No, your question is my favorite question, and I don't know if it's the answer, but I have some answers. But Ed is exactly right. Unlike the power sector, which is 80% investor-owned and is dominated by a dozen big companies, the water sector is balkanized beyond belief. There are more than 60,000 water utilities in the country, and most of them serve 10,000 people or less. And you're exactly right. Fixed costs are fixed, and the fewer number of people that you are spreading those fixed costs among, independent of volume, the higher the bill becomes right out of the gate. And I think the question of how to collaborate between small systems is one of the principal issues before us in the water sector. And the analogy I'd use is to a lawnmower. Because the question of, I have no problem personally with private or public. At DC Water, I used to say, we'll compete with any other organization on cost anywhere, anytime. I don't care if they're investor-owned or public. Who's the best out there at someone, and let's compete with them. Not compete like for customers, but on dollars. How much does it cost just you to do something, and how much can we do? But we had scale. And the lawn, but the issue of taking over, so a private company coming in and taking over often raises these emotional battles that are often consuming so much time and effort. It never gets to the underlying issue. Here's the lawnmower analogy. Everybody on the street needs their lawn cut. The most inefficient way to do that is for every single household to buy their own lawnmower, to have the space for the lawnmower, to buy the gas and the oil for the lawnmowers, to figure out how to use it safely, because lots of people get injured every year because they use lawnmowers improperly. Where if you had one person cutting the lawn for all of those, it's still your lawn. No privatization here, it's your lawn. You tell us when you want it cut, how long you want it cut, all that stuff. Your choice. So we don't go into the political question of who owns what. It's your lawn. But I'm going to buy the best freaking lawnmower on the market. I'm going to have a person who has been trained to the hilt to be the best lawnmower operator ever. And the only thing you're going to pay for is that little sliver of time when we're cutting your lawn. And you don't have to worry about where the lawnmower is, maintaining it, buying the oil. We'll take care of all of that. It'll still be much cheaper for you to hire our lawnmower service for your lawn than if everybody has their own lawnmower. And the system now, particularly in the small rurals, is that everybody's doing everything independently with all the overhead charges and all the fixed costs that you'd have rather than sharing, not giving or not giving away of joint services. And it's a market that is waiting to be disrupted in that fashion, like has happened in so many other sectors. Because of places like South, it's a story you hear all over, and it's the same not just in rural areas, but distressed urban areas. How could we band together? It's Rudy Chow and I have had this conversation, who runs the DPW in Baltimore. Why is it that so many water utilities in the region, big or small, each have their own customer service operation? Again, overhead, why do we have one center customer service operation? Maybe at some point it gets so big that it's not close enough to the customer. So you're always wondering about that separation. But how to share services, big or small, so that we're not all buying the same things over and over. Take it one other step. And this is my view, is that the future for water utilities is to figure this question out. How to jointly do things so it's cheaper for each of the individual ones by banding together. And second, focusing on 2 or 3 technical innovations that exist today that relate to existing expenditures. It is very difficult to get a jurisdiction, mayoral control or otherwise, to spend money on something new that they don't do. But every water utility has leakage issues. Every water utility has groundwater issues. Every water utility has to handle water main breaks. It may be very expensive in it, but they're already in their budgets. So if what we focus on is jointly 50 communities coming together, we're all going to adopt an anti-leakage problem. Because leakage means we've taken water, we've treated it, and it's leaking into the ground. So we spent all this money on it, and it's out the window because we have old pipes. If we improve the pipe, we're saving cash money we're already spending. And if we band together with 25 other communities to do it, so we'll pick one enterprise to come in and help us, it drops the cost per unit as if we were in a bigger city. And now I got a solution. I got technology to bear. I can deploy it. I've done it with 25 other communities, and we've shared the cost and gained the benefit. To me, that is waiting to happen in the water sector, because your question is exactly right on.
And my answer piggybacks right on George, what he just said. Baltimore's trying to catch up on our infrastructure investment. We've delayed it so long that the system is just basically past its useful life. So Director Chow has said we're going to do 15 miles of pipe every year. So then over the course of 100 years, he's trying to just replace all the pipes. It's new pipes. So that's going to give you savings right there. But I would say this, just to cut it short. Look at your, are you familiar with the capital improvement plan in your local, in your budget book? What you'll do is you'll go to either Public Works or whatever, whoever controls your water. It should be Public Works, but maybe not, or whatever jurisdiction. Look in there and see for the current year how much is, it's going to show you what they're going to spend the money on. And then it's going to give you a 6-year plan. So for us, this year it's $858 million. And then for the next 6 years, it's $2.9 billion. So that right there kind of justifies what we're trying to do as far as bringing all facilities up to just replacement or rehabilitation, replacing the water main pipes and everything. That's going to kind of justify, I think George said this earlier, what we're doing with it. So your money is kind of, or that bill justifies what why it's costing $200. But you should really look at the capital improvement plan. It's going to outline the anticipated construction cost that's going to back into that bill.
And just a short comment, the country which does routinely and has for over 100 years what you just suggest, which is to pool lots of municipalities under management of one water company, is France. No? Veolia's business or Suez's business, that's what they do.
So each of you earlier talked a lot about kind of innovative financing and how you're controlling revenues and costs and operating your systems to be sustainable in sort of an ongoing way in that respect. But I was wondering if you could talk more about the underlying finances behind that, how each of your systems is debt financed, equity financed, some other structure, either here or if Mr. Pignard would like to talk about some of the foreign projects as well. It would be interesting to kind of compare the sustainability of the financial structures that your systems have seen.
I'll answer that real quick, and then for DC Water, we run about a $600 million operating budget and a $600 million capital budget, so it's over $1 billion in expenditures. All operating is cash funded. We do not ever debt finance operating expense, and that is from our ratepayers. We are not subsidized by anyone. All of our revenue is revenue that comes from ratepayers in one fashion or another. For capital financing, we very carefully manage how that is financed. Some of it is cash finance, we call it pay-go. About 35 to 40%. The rating agencies do not want to see too much debt. They want to know how much debt you're running compared to your revenues over a 10-year plan to understand the viability of the enterprise. We do go to markets every year for debt financing as well. And the portion of our bill that has increased the fastest is on debt service, because our capital budget has grown so fast, mostly for mandated projects, but also for all these others. But it's very carefully managed. We go to our finance committee every quarter on evaluating, because we have a AAA accredited agency, which as I said, is very rare. And that saves our ratepayers money. And if we debt finance too much, they would downgrade us. But if we debt finance not enough so that we'd had to grab more for rates and we had a problem there, that would be a problem too. So it's a very careful balance, but it's about 60-40 debt to cash in our in CapEx. OpEx is all cash.
For Baltimore City, we service 1.8 million people, primarily 400,000 accounts in Baltimore City, 400,000 accounts in Baltimore County. So that's the accounts, but remember, a household can have 3 or 4 people in that. With that being said, we're financed primarily through revenue bonds. We may go to the bond market every 2 or 3 years. We receive funding from state revolving fund. We also use pay-go, which is cash, as well as a new program this year, with you. So that's something we, as I mentioned earlier, we have to maintain certain coverage ratios. So it's a complex model. Every from about the 27th to the 5th of the month is when I don't have any. I just don't sleep because we've got to hit revenue targets that supports whatever we projected, and we have to make that bond coverage. So, but we're primarily revenue bonds.
As Veolia, we were a private for-profit company that operated water systems, in some cases for public utilities. So the way we integrated the two models in terms of the financing is, as any private for-profit company, there's 2 things that drive your success: revenue and profitability. How much money do you make, and how much of that do you have to use on certain things as compared to dividends and so on. So what we were striving to do was be as efficient and as innovative as possible so that our cost to operate a system for somebody was as far away from the revenue that we were allowed to get because of the rate structure in a given contract. We were trying to keep that space as big as possible, obviously, because that's how you support your shareholders and so on. So that was the incentive. That's a financial incentive to be efficient and innovative. The other thing that we were moving towards, and I think this is an area that's going to be it's turning to be a game changer in this business, is this taking that model of performance-based contracting into the water arena. I mean, as George commented, this is an area that's been around for technically thousands of years, providing water to society, and changing that business model so that rather than here's a gallon, give me X number of dollars. It's more the service of providing that gallon and compensating the performance of how efficient that is. One last comment in terms of the point about economy of scale. One of the things that we were able to do as Veolia, we were 150 years old, 180,000 employees, $26 billion a year, 40 countries. However, we operated waste facilities, water and wastewater plants where we might have had one or two people on location. It might be a rural system in the middle of, out there, and that's what we had. However, those two individuals had the firepower behind them in terms of technology, innovation, practices of that $26 billion, 180,000 employees, so on and so forth. So that's another variation on the theme of economy of scale in terms of leveraging that's where the public-private partnerships I think are so valuable, and that is you leverage all of that comes from all these different players, and you package all that into the perfect little hybrid scenario that works in any given situation. And for us, what we did in Milwaukee was different than what we did in New York, than what we did in Berlin, than what we did in Melbourne. It was all different, but it was always mixing the public, the private skill sets and strengths in a given area into the business model.
Okay, can I just address that young lady for one more thing we didn't talk about? There's another aspect that affects water bills. Baltimore City's under a consent decree, which is going to cost us about $1 billion. So we're forced to deal with our wastewater. It was overflows within, I think, 2026 is the deadline. If we could have spread that out over 30 years or whatever to fix those issues, our bill would be lower. But because it's compressed, there's no other way but to absorb that cost in the rate increase for water bills. So there's some legal issues, some mandated things, stormwater. So all that goes into the cost of that bill that you may be experiencing.
In terms of the water bonds, how do you deal with the credit rating if there's a persisting shortage? I mean, in the long run, you still want a sustainable way to attract investor. Thank you.
It's based on your credit rating, and it's based on the financial models, the forecasting, the ability to forecasting. And I'll let everybody else expand on it. But it's.
I love the credit rating, and to me, it's another communications question. Some of it is financial. What are your ratios? Are you hitting them? Are you generating the revenue? The other is, are you communicating well with the rating agencies? So we constantly were inviting rating agencies to visit us. I started going on the road tours, which used to be just the finance people, but that's where you go and talk to investors directly. And a lot of that presentation was always financial. And of course, it needs to be financial. But I wanted the investor to hear the same value proposition for what this was being used for that a customer would hear. And when we did a century bond, never done before in the water industry, we were seeking a bond that has a 100-year maturity. We had no idea if anyone was going to buy it because it had never been done before. And so I went on the road show, and we went around the country selling it to investors. We were selling $300 million on the day of the trade. You finance people, this is fascinating. We're at Goldman Sachs office on the 40th floor looking out over the Hudson, and there's all those little numbers on it. I'm a lawyer, I didn't know. You're watching the basis points going up and down on the day on your deal, and every basis points change, that's 1/100th of an interest rate. 1% of interest, saved or cost our ratepayers $600,000. So all of a sudden you're watching there going, oh, good God, 600 grand every basis point change. But the more buyers that come in, the lower you can drop the interest that you offer because as supply and demand, so we ended up having $1.1 billion in buy orders. Totally caught us by surprise, way oversubscribed. We added $50 million to the offering, and we dropped the basis points by 16 basis points because of the interest. And I think the reason there is interest is part in water, we're going to be around. So it's not like you're going to invest in something where some form or another, DC Water will be in existence like we have been forever. So it's a good long-term investment. And there's a lot of money chasing long-term returns, certain returns. And second, we made the pitch. And as a result, we saved our ratepayers millions of dollars. And actually, we're able to raise even more low-cost money than we expected out of the gate. So much of this does come down to not just having good numbers, which of course you need, but telling the story to an investor. They want to hear the same thing. And my experience with investors, which is very narrow, it's not as I know enough to be dangerous, but investors want to make money, but there's plenty of them out there that want to know that when they're making money, they're doing something valuable at the same time. That this matters. I'm investing in something, I'm going to make a cash return, the cash return makes sense to me, and I'm doing something that's good for the world. And that's a pitch that you've got to make. It's not going to happen by accident.
All right, last question. This is pressure. So I'm Joniel Chaw. I'm one of the organizers of this conference with Erica, and thank you very much for joining us and sharing with us. I have two questions. The first is, as you mentioned regarding P3s, what are some of the opportunities for public-private partnerships that you have identified, including the benefits potentially, as well as the challenges facing that? And then my second question is, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I was working with them earlier on management of river dams, and they were looking at the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to try to see how they could share risks and liabilities. And so I'm wondering if you were to engage in a P3, how you would envision the risk sharing in that way.
I know Ed will have a lot of thoughts. I'll just answer quickly. P3s to me are always been part of the industry. We do design build on all our big contracts. That's sharing risk with the design build team. The big question to me on a P3, and I have no issue with private, we've hired virtually every freaking private company on earth at DC Water over time. But the question for a private entity on a P3 is if we're going to go into a partnership with a private firm that they're interested in because they can make money from it, the first question, and God love them, I have no problem with that, is if they can make money from it, is there some way to structure it that additional money would come to me? Can my own ratepayers fund whatever it is? Can we do what's at hand and generate that benefit and turn it back to our ratepayers? Which is true in some cases. Or is the relationship with the private enterprise something that we can't do? So the reason why they're gaining the income, the sharing of the savings, is because they're bringing something to the table that we don't have, so that the two of us are bigger and stronger and better than either one of us alone. So some P3s we don't trigger because we think we can do it ourselves and save that money directly for our own ratepayers. And some we do with a private firm because they're bringing something that we don't have. So we won't get the savings unless the P3 comes in. I think the big challenge, and we had this, we were going to hire Veolia for a performance contract to look at our drinking water treatment site and decided not to. And it wasn't because I didn't think it was a good idea. It was because we have environmental advocates in the city. And there's a point here that if you give a firm the incentive to make money only by cutting their costs, I'm not saying this is true, but the fear is they'll cut costs that they shouldn't cut. And on water services, we can't afford that. We don't want, so we opted, even though I think it might have been better for us, not to go with a performance contract. We just paid Veolia a cash fee because the stakeholders in DC were afraid that if we did that we'd be interested in cutting costs to make money that might not be costs we should cut. There are things that we shouldn't do. And I didn't think that was true, but I didn't want to have to, it just seemed like I could cover that. We have enough to cover it, our costs, and if we save money from the projects, we'll just save it. And Veolia has a certain cash flow. It wasn't the savings. But that's usually the issue you hear. If it's a P3 and you make your money from that margin between the revenue you know you're going to get and how much you can reduce your costs, are you going to reduce your costs past where they ought to be reduced or not? I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's the fear.
And that gets to how you craft the relationship. And I think this is an evolving area. P3 is a kind of a very general term. You know, if you got a private company and a public company engaged, technically that's a public entity. That's a P3. But what's really the nuance here is the innovation in P3s. And if you do performance-based, how do you make that definition so that you don't get below a certain threshold and so on? So I think that's the magic. I think one other thing I want to comment in terms of other kind of P3s is the private P, that's changing. You know, a lot of historically, when we talk about P3s in this discussion, we're talking about a private water service provider, you know, like a Veolia. But water-related P3s could involve agricultural supply chain companies. It could involve other sectors that are,
Power.
Power. Other sectors that are water users but are not necessarily in the water business that could be part of this. California was another interesting observation that I'll be done of California was at the same time that there was a drought and the farms were struggling for irrigation water, the oil and gas industry was pumping millions of gallons of water out of the aquifers, treating the water by requirement, and out it went into the ocean. So it was like, well, can't that water be used for irrigation and aquifer recharge and so on? So this public-private partnership can actually include private entities that were never considered part of this discussion historically, but were clearly players in the water business. Dr. Klein made a great point. 71% of freshwater use is actually agriculture. It's not, the residential use of water, clean water, is 10 to 15%, depending where you are in the country. Then there's like 18 to 20% goes to industry, and the rest is agriculture. So, why that's not part of the P in P3 is a big question.
Thank you very much. We hit time. It was great. Troy, George, Edwin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the food has showed up. You can exit through this door, and it's in the next adjacent room.
So I'm Debbie Blevis. I'm the director of the Energy Resources and Environment Program. I'm moderating this particular panel, which I've had many of these guys as students of mine in the past, so it's Old Home Week. The purpose here is this is the structure we're going to follow. So each of the panel members, and we'll start with Natalia, will give 15 minutes about themselves and about what the work they do. Hopefully giving a little bit of a sense also, as former Sci students, what roles or what levels of education really particularly help them in the work they're doing now. And so we'll have 15 minutes each. I'll be a very tough timekeeper. And then we'll have a half an hour for questions and answers. Okay? I'm going to note some interests of our students, so if you guys are covering these topics, please feel free to engage in talking about that either in your current job or in previous jobs. So the areas, renewables is very hot amongst our students. The whole issue of resiliency has obviously become very hot since Harvey. Electric transportation is also a very hot topic and a lot of interest. Storage, energy storage, and in general, the whole challenge of the grid, both in terms of handling renewables, but also in terms of the role of storage on the grid. And then, very important, is the challenge of rural electrification. So I know several of you guys took classes with me in which we talked a lot about rural electrification. So again, in your roles, either now or previously, if you want to sort of pick those up, if only to note pathways that were particularly helpful for you. The one quick question I have for Janelle is, when we do these slides, everybody's going to block it. Do you have a proposed strategy?
So yeah, when Natalia presents it, all the panels can come sit in the front rows, and when the clicker's on the podium, you can use that and come back up.
Okay, so Natalia has brought slides, so if my other panelists can move off the podium and temporarily, and again, I'm gonna stay up here since I'm away, and I'll time keep. So remember, you tell a little bit about yourself before you get into anything additional.
So it's forward and back on this? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia Leota. I graduated SICE in 2012. Let's see, I made a slide on myself. So I graduated SICE in 2012, studied in Bologna. I was an ERE major. I did the energy practicum where I worked with the Carbon War Room, working with them all of my second year on a brick industry specific study for India and reducing black I think it was black carbon emissions from that. So there's a study actually published online. If you go to the Carbon War Room, you could read that study. It was public, and that was a really great experience. From there, through the SICE network, I was able to network and get an internship my last semester of SICE with PFC Energy. I'm going to go out of order here. I realized that I posted my most recent experience first, but I will go from chronologically from SICE. I started at PFC Energy in the downstream oil sector, doing their research products and analyzing North American downstream markets. And after the company was acquired by IHS, which later became IHS Market, and that's where Nikolai works, there they started a program that was a pilot program for young professionals, and I was able to rotate into different energy spaces, into different groups, where I worked in the upstream sector, doing upstream cost analysis. This is all prior to the collapse of oil. And I also worked in the oil risk group, and from there I moved on to some forecasting products and oil markets products, where we were doing short-term forecasting of demand and supply of the oil sector globally. And so I was there until 2016, and my SICE classmate that was working for Department of Energy as a contractor gave me a call and said that they were hiring in his office, and it was the loan program's office. And it was like my dream come true. 4 years working post-SICE, I finally get to work on renewable energy. So I accepted this position as a contractor associate working in the loan program's office, and there I had 3 large solar projects in my portfolio, totaling 500 megawatts of solar power, and they amounted to more than $1.3 billion in outstanding loans. So it was more of a project management role, where it's the project finance side of things on the backside once everything was already built and running, just kind of making sure on a daily basis the borrower is doing what they're supposed to be doing. They would request regular disbursements of monthly funds, and they would have to report back to me on their performance. And the fun parts were when we had to renegotiate terms of agreements with their PPAs or other legal documents. So it was a really great experience to work with legal engineering teams and other finance professionals. Since then, the last year I've been in Scully Capital. I still work for the same company, Archetype. As you see, my slide deck says Archetype. But I moved on from a contractor role at DOE to more of a consultant role at Scully Capital, where it's more financial advisory for infrastructure projects. And Department of Energy was one of the clients of Scully Capital. Scully Capital was acquired by Archetype 3 years ago. So they used to work side by side. Both of the companies work side by side in different roles. At Department of Energy, that's one example. There are other parts of the federal government where they work together, and so that was like the synergies created there, and I was able to go over to Scully Capital and help them with other Department of Energy work they had in consulting services. And I've also transitioned into more of a transportation expert. I am working with FRA on Amtrak, so I'm assessing the financial performance and monitoring of Amtrak for them on a monthly basis. And then I also work with Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Management on their risk assessment of decommissioning offshore oil and gas and offshore renewable energy. So we don't have a lot of examples of decommissioning renewable energy yet, but we have to prepare for that when the time comes. And so that's kind of my professional transition. And before SICE, I was in a very different sphere. I was in democracy and governance, focused in Eastern Europe, but based here in DC. And I had an interest in geopolitics and energy, and how the former Soviet space and energy was just a really fascinating topic to me, so that's how SICE and ERE brought me here. So I will try to, I don't have that much time. So Scully Capital, just to give you an overview, so it's just a small part of Archetype. Archetype is a larger company. It's based in Columbus, Ohio. And if you want to learn more about them, they have contracts at DoD, OPIC, and other various agencies, and around the country as well in other states. So you could go to archetypeusa.com to learn more about Archetype, but I'm going to focus my presentation on Scully Capital. But the main parts of what I want to talk about Scully Capital's portfolio is that we help create and manage loan guarantee programs, such as the one I worked on in DOE, the Loan Programs Office, and help finance renewable energy projects through loan guarantees. And then we also provide financial advisory, program management, financial and technical underwriting, and servicing for large infrastructure and energy projects. So these are just kind of some of the pillars I brought out from Archetype strengths, and Scully Capital pretty much does all of this. But probably we could just briefly look at the infrastructure and project finance list. So we do everything from the project development, consulting, financial advisory, lender due diligence. That's probably the largest part of our portfolio recently. And also the transaction risk assessments and credit approval support, the financial modeling and the development of that. Just to highlight the recent projects that my teammates have worked on, there's the large I-66 outside of the Beltway Express Lane Department of Transportation loan that was approved. We helped structure we were the financial advisor advising Department of Transportation on structuring that $1.2 billion loan to the Spanish company that won the concession. So that was approved recently. And then Moynihan Station in New York, the Empire State Development is doing redevelopment of that station. And that was, I believe, a $530 million loan from Department of Transportation as well. So those are kind of the most recent ones we worked on. We've kind of already gone over this, but other sectors that we focus on, water supply and wastewater, renewable energy, obviously, my background, rail and transit, also something I work on a lot, and then roads and crossings, port infrastructure, maritime, and wastewater and public use facilities. So I have a couple of slides too with pretty photos of actual projects that we have helped develop, and just kind of give you a little highlight of the volume of these deals that we have worked on. So, just alone in roads and crossings are bridges. It's over $11 billion in financing from Department of Transportation that we have advised them on. So really unique projects. We've done everything from the due diligence to revenue studies and financial modeling and risk mitigation for closing out the deal. So I have to move forward. You guys can ask me later if you want more information. This is one of the solar projects that we advised on. That's Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. I believe this is Tonopah. No, I might be wrong. Not my project, so I need to check on that. So just quickly on energy, it's mainly renewable, everything from wind to solar to biogas facilities. We have been a financial advisor on to the lenders, to the off-takers, developers, so a really diverse portfolio here as well. Primarily in the U.S., we have done some international work with Exim and OPIC in India and Pakistan, and some desalination projects in Latin America. I think this might be my last kind of sector slide. In rail and transit, we work a lot with light rail, railroads. So we are usually the lender's financial advisor, and that's Department of Transportation. Really fascinating project. So it's right now we don't have any active deals. We are closing out and writing the risk assessments and preparing, like setting up DOT to run those loans. The last one, and this is the one I have the least exposure to currently because it's a little slow, but we are helping EPA's WIFIA program get off the ground. We are helping formulate the program. Right now, WIFIA is intaking applicants, so they haven't lent any money. They're still reviewing applications. And so we expect it to get busier given the infrastructure plan announcements from the president recently. So there'll be more work coming from WIFIA for us. And in the past, we have done work, as I mentioned, the desalination. This one was in California. We were a developer's financial advisor. And then varies like North American Development Bank, that was a while ago. But not as much water infrastructure development in our portfolio in the last 5 years. WIFIA has been kind of the most renewed one we've been working on, but primarily we've been doing a lot of renewable energy and transit, transportation and roads. So that is kind of, in a nutshell, I know it's a lot of information, and all of this is available on the website. So if you go to scullycapital.com, it's all on there. And I will leave my business cards up here for you guys if you want to email me and get more information. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Okay, could we have our panel return up? And Alfredo, you're on. I think maybe it would be helpful to speak at the podium.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm Alfie Zarati. I went to SAIS and graduated in 2011. I was a Latin American Studies concentrator and international finance concentrator. I stumbled into energy. I did an internship at OPIC over the summer between my 2 years and really got my first exposure to a wind farm that AES was developing in Jordan. And so got to learn more about that, the process that a developer would undertake to mitigate the risk and negotiate the loan agreements. And I just was hooked and really wanted to focus on project finance, and just so happened that my experience was in energy. So I applied to jobs and then eventually took a job in New York at Credit Agricole doing North American project finance in energy and infrastructure, which was a fantastic opportunity. I saw a lot of deals, a lot of financial advisory work, a lot of commercial lending. The only hitch was that it was North America focused, and I went to SAIS. So it was good for a while, but then I got a call from a headhunter in Houston who worked for a company called Accelerate Energy that developed LNG import and export terminals around the world. And I thought, aha, here we go. I can combine everything that I've been passionate about for 4 years into one job. And I moved to Houston with my wife. We lived there for 4 years, had a lot of fun developing projects all over the world in Argentina, Brazil, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, really working with banks and working with attorneys to develop the contracts, do the financial modeling, get projects over the line, and get the shareholder to invest. The only hitch with that job was that I was in Houston, and my family's from DC. And my wife and I now have a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old, not getting a lot of sleep. But we moved back to be closer to family when I found a job at Deloitte that combined all those interests and experiences really well. So at Deloitte, I work in their infrastructure and capital projects group. A lot of the work overlaps with what Natalia was describing that her team does. It's doing financial advisory work to the TIFIA, WIFIA, and some of those other programs that are basically federal loans, and representing either the government to do due diligence on applications, or representing developers that are looking to go and borrow, or to work with actual owners when they're constructing the project to improve the cost and schedule. Deloitte's a big company, and there's a lot of people that work in the energy space within our practice. Another client that we have that's been pretty important is the Department of State, and they have a Bureau of Energy Resources where they go and work with foreign ministries, national oil companies, power regulators all over Latin America and Africa, and help them think through some pressing challenges that they're facing. One could be, how do you incentivize developers to, submit applications for renewable energy? Well, you need auction criteria that are, based on leading practice. Because if you're a developer, you could invest in Argentina, or you could invest in Chile, or you could invest wherever. How do you raise the standards so that you make your auction palatable and attractive? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. So we'll go and work with the Ministry of Energy of Argentina to help them. Another example was related to decommissioning. We worked with the Ministry of Energy and Mines of Mauritania to decommission an offshore oil field. It was a FPSO that had been in operation for 30 years. The operator wasn't economic anymore given the downturn of oil. So we helped them structure a commercial arrangement and schedule that made sense for everybody in a cash-constrained environment. So there's a lot of different avenues to apply the knowledge and the skills that you learn at SAIS and that you can pick up as your career advances in financial analysis and understanding international regulations, working collaboratively with teammates in a multidisciplinary setting. So I think what you're learning here at SAIS is really going to set you up well if you want to work in international energy and infrastructure. That's sort of everything in a nutshell. How am I really light on time?
You're very light on time.
Okay. I guess I can talk a little bit more in detail about some of the projects that we're specifically looking at regarding, renewables.
Maybe you can talk about how your background here plays in renewables.
Yeah, sure. So I think really with, for renewable power, a lot of it's how do you structure a project that is self-sustaining. And in emerging markets, you don't necessarily have sophisticated power markets where you have clarity in terms of day-ahead pricing and what actually you can earn as revenue. There's also physical constraints too. Sometimes the infrastructure in developing economies is poor, and you don't necessarily have the resiliency that you would in the U.S. You can have pockets of demand, so you need to have you need to overcome transportation issues and transmission issues. So I think really working at SAIS, or having studied at SAIS, what I've learned is that you can pick up a regulation and come through it and really get comfortable with what they're trying to get at, but then also put that into a financial model and see what the value is. So it's transferring information from one format to another, and then at Deloitte, it's really presenting it so you can make the client understand what your conclusion is, and you can start helping people move across the finish line when you come to financial close. I think that's really the big thing that I took away from being at SAIS. And also it's just, working hard, because SAIS is a hard school and clients are demanding. So I think that's the other, the big takeaway. In terms of storage, energy storage has been a really popular topic for a lot of clients for a lot of different reasons. One of the main reasons would be because of, in Peru, for example, they've got transmission issues in the sense that they have pockets of demand where they cannot serve customers efficiently. And for them to go and build a new transmission line would be a lot more capital intensive than it would be for them to potentially pair solar with storage and create microgrids. So the government there is really interested in doing that. They have other issues as well in terms of regulatory challenges to vertical integration. You have a lot of multinationals coming into Peru trying to acquire development companies before they actually start producing power in a way to circumvent an anti-monopolistic regulation. So it's working with them hand in hand on that front to solve the issue of allowing promoting storage projects. So a lot of times it's in emerging markets, at least, you have a central issue you want to solve, but to get to it, you need to overcome 3 or 4 obstacles prior. So I guess that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Happy to take questions. I didn't know we were talking for 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Nikolai.
Hi guys, Nikolai Filchev, also class of 2011. I did the ERE concentration here, and before SAIS I was doing economic consulting for about 4 years in Los Angeles and here in Washington DC. But I had a clear interest in infrastructure and energy, and getting into SAIS allowed me to pursue that. What I did here was mostly focused on renewable energy, mostly solar. I was also doing some project finance work at a place down the street as an internship. I also did an internship with the Clean Transportation NGO. That was actually, I just remembered that. They helped uncover the Volkswagen diesel scandal, the International Council on Clean Transportation. At that time, they weren't that visible. Now everybody knows their name. But I kind of found out that I'm not cut out for the NGO public kind of sector, so I wanted to go back into the private field. And around the time of my graduation, solar was really hot. So I had a very good opportunity with Sun Edison. I went pretty far along the process, but also at that time, my current employer, their North American natural gas group was looking for somebody who had done data analysis and had solid skills in terms of doing regressions and things like that. So I went through interviews with them, and I figured that would be a great fit for me, just utilizing my previous skills. And I knew next to nothing on natural gas. I still can, I don't know, I still can't say for sure that I know everything about natural gas in North America, but I've learned a lot over the last 6.5 years. The position that they hired me for was focused initially on demand forecasting, residential, commercial, industrial demand for the US lower 48 and Canada. And I did that for about 2.5 years before I realized that I needed to get a little more closer to the market to actually understand how the market operates, how all the different players work. So I transitioned into a regional analyst role, covering markets extending from the Gulf Coast to the Southeast and then part of the Mid-Continent, some of the producing areas there. What the regional analyst in my team does is they cover the fundamentals of the business. What's happening with supply, what's happening with demand, knowing the operations of the pipelines, following infrastructure projects, and what that will mean on prices and basis in the various regions. Once I have done some work on focusing on regional analytics, it turned out that a lot of our consulting engagement, and I'll explain our model shortly. We have a lot of applied consulting projects related to LNG expansions, related to offtake industrial users. Also, we did projects around natural gas storage. I know it's not the storage that you would think about, but natural gas storage is also pretty important, and what the value of natural gas storage would be in the future given the changing demand profile in North America. So I've done quite a bit of consulting over the last 2-3 years. I've led projects myself, and I've dealt with clients directly, although I have, 80% of my job is supposed to be just fundamentals analysis. It's not, consulting is just something you do on the side, and you don't say no when it comes through the door. That's as much probably I want to say about my current job. In terms of the company, IHS, and now known as IHS Markit, has changed tremendously over the last 7 years. When I started, it was about 5,000 people. Now we are 13,000 people. We've grown mostly through acquisitions, but the focus, at least in the last year or so, is just on organic growth. IHS Markit does a lot of different things. Energy is just one of the verticals. I'm I mean, in our space, the teams typically are just the regular fundamental shops. They do mostly retainer products, subscription-based business. So, catering to the needs of the people who buy the service. So you produce regular reports and analytical pieces, but you also do consulting on the side. We have each team has a target to meet on an annual basis, and that's why when a consulting team comes through the door, you rarely say no unless it's something that you can't do at all, completely out of your expertise. Let's see what else I can say about the company. We are all over the world. We acquired PFC, where Natalia used to work. Now we've integrated them seamlessly. We're all one and the same. 13,000 people, as I said. Public company. And we a number of folks from SAIS actually work in IHS market. You'll be surprised. Different opportunities, of course, but there's a huge renewables team. I was thinking about moving there for a little while, but then there was some tightness in the market from our clients, so we were not hiring for a while. We're now beginning to rebuild that practice, so we'll see how things go. Also, in the last few years, of course, we've been hit a lot by the softness in the oil and gas, the oil space. So we've had to kind of buckle up a little bit and do more with less. But I think that's the case in any public company. You do more with less all the time. You try to improve. You try to get new products because somebody on the street will beat you with something new. The focus in recent years, I can see, is recent months, I guess, to bring out more analytic products, just visualization of data, getting the stuff that you produce more embedded into clients' operations, so they rely on you 100%. They don't look at somebody else's data. It's a very saturated space, and very little separates the different companies. So I think it's a tough environment to be in. But yeah.
Who do you see as your major competitors?
It's Wood Mackenzie. They were acquired by a big company a couple of years ago. Pyra. Also, of course, ICF is doing a lot of stuff. Bentech, Argus Media, ABB. So ABB is a classic example of a company doing different things. ABB is a huge German company, and they were essentially a data provider for a while. But they said, okay, why are we just providing data? How about we do some more analytics and kind of try to displace competitors? So they're now encroaching into the space held by other fundamental shops and providing their own take on things, and their data is very good. So once you get used to the platform and you're fully vested in, it's tough to move away. And the value proposition is pretty great there. So, and other companies are trying to do the same. We're trying to do the same. It's tough out there. One thing I remember to say: why is SAIS and SAIS education good for this type of job that I do? If you guys are geeks to a large extent, I presume you like writing papers. That's perfect for a fundamental shop. You get into a topic, you delve in, you can produce a paper and get it out. The company will publish it for you. You want to pore over data and find insights? The world is yours. You can do whatever you want. Ability to work in teams is fantastic and challenging at the same time, and you get all of that here. The only thing that's missing in my current position, of course, is the global focus. I'm very specifically North American focused. We separate Mexico from North America internally. I've done some stuff with Mexico, but I still can't say I'm doing global stuff. I've been doing some LNG, but just in terms of knowing the outlooks and understanding what's driving things. But I am not doing anything global. But there are opportunities to do global stuff.
Great. Thank you. Felix.
Hi everyone, my name is Felix. Graduated SAIS in 2014, a year in Bologna, a year in DC. I also did the EOE program. And I have less experience to look back on, so I'll keep that section short and talk a bit about the trends and some of the elements that were already brought up here. I work with a company called ICF. After SAIS, I was job hunting for a while. I continued my internship at a Northeast Group, which is a SAIS company that was founded by a couple of SAIS guys that are doing market forecasting for smart grid around the world. So I was doing market research in developing countries. And the role that I'm in at ICF now is within the commercial energy advisory services team, working with environmental power markets. And so specifically focused on programs like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, programs like the California AB32 Cap and Trade Program, the Western Climate Initiative, Ontario's Cap and Trade programs. I spent a year in Ontario, in Toronto. And in general, ICF works on a broad number of issues, for anything from healthcare to cybersecurity, IT, social services, and one of the biggest groups we have is infrastructure and energy. And as Nikolai mentioned, sort of we're all sort of in the commercial space, working with sort of private sector clients, where IHS is more on the so subscription-based services and the on and off consulting arrangement. It's almost the opposite. At ICF, we work majority-wise with consulting agreements, and here and then we have a few subscription services, especially on the natural gas side, that we work on as well. One of the projects that I've been sort of very involved in over the last 3 to 4 years is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Cap and Trade program that is now hopefully or maybe expanding to include New Jersey again, potentially Virginia. And they essentially go through a program review every 4 years where they look at all that's happened in the program. They look at the emission trajectory of all the states that are included in the program, and they model different pathways of what the program could look like over the next 10, 15, 20 years, taking into consideration elements like, okay, if we tighten our emissions cap by X amount of tons, what are our energy prices going to look like? What are the emissions from different sources going to look like? So it's very much a forecasting exercise, and that is very much the work that we do for example, for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We're also active working with state and regional actors on RPS programs, on renewable deployment and modeling through impacts on emissions, power sector, power prices, energy and capacity prices. Back when the Clean Power Plan was still a thing, we were very active in that space, given that ICF developed and maintains the model that EPA uses to model all their air quality regulations. So if you one number that always sticks in my head is a 30% reduction in emissions through the Clean Power Plan. It's sort of one of the widely quoted numbers. It's not actually a target; it's an output of a model that's based on certain assumptions that were put into the model, right? So that is one of the elements that we worked on a lot. One of the things that attracted me to the work is that, given that we are doing forecasting exercises, we're using sort of sophisticated models that we either develop or license to do our projections. It's a very quantitative skill set that is required. I took classes like project finance, like corporate finance, and familiarity with data and numbers is sort of an essential almost in any position that we're hearing about today, I think. And at the same time, looking at environmental regulations, you need to be familiar with the aspects of the market. Right, so what do renewable portfolio standards look like across the United States? What are the developments in each of those states, and how do these portfolio standards drive renewable developments? What is the actual text that is in the Clean Power Plan? It's about a 1,400-page document, if I remember correctly. We were all very excited when it came out, and we had a lot of reading to do. And then, so it combines elements like the quantitative side, it combines the market knowledge, and it also includes the sort of the regulatory policy focus, which I think is one of the elements that SAIS does really well. It combines different aspects. You're not going to be an exclusive statistics person. You're not going to be an exclusive markets person. You're going to have elements from all these different aspects within your education, and you're going to be able to apply those elements sort of in a holistic manner to deliver value to your customers. That's what you're going to end up doing in a consulting type engagement. Some of the trends that I think are, as Eva mentioned, looking at the current markets. I was at a conference in Toronto in the fall, and Ontario is a very interesting market, and it's quite a large power system if you think about the Toronto as a city and then also the province itself. At the same time, it's very advanced in the sense that it has no coal, it has almost no gas generation, it is almost exclusively nuclear, hydro, and renewables. So if you think about a power system that, you know, in an idealistic version you could imagine for the United States, you look at that system, it's not that far off from what you could imagine here in the United States if you wanted to decarbonize. And you can look at the challenges that come with that. And one of the things that apply, I think, to the US and to the general power sector, which is sort of my focus in my work, was that the keynote had a chart that I think encompasses a lot of the elements we're talking about. It was when you look at generation, transmission, and distribution, and where the value sits. Right? Basically, until the last 5 years, you had a really big bubble with generation, you had quite a big bubble with transmission, and you had somewhat of a bubble there with distribution, right? Because in the end, it's customers, right? They consume, they don't interact. They're fairly disconnected from who builds my power plant, what value does a power plant have. And then the next slide was how does that value look like in 10, 15 years? You have a decently sized bubble with generation, still a decent sized bubble with transmission, and a really big bubble with distribution, right? Consumers are no longer consuming, they're interacting and they're making policy. Essentially, when you think about elements like electric vehicles, I think the CEO from the biggest Toronto utility, their goal over the next, I think, 10 years is that if you have an electric vehicle, you no longer have to drive more than 2 blocks to charge your car. In a city as big as Toronto, which has greater Toronto area, 5-6 million people, 2 blocks. All these people are going to come in after work, going to plug their car in. Right, so already when everybody else turns their TVs on, turns their stoves on, turns their lights on, you're now at 2.5 million electric vehicles through the grid. What grid is going to be able to sustain that? It's not possible with the current system, right? At the same time, when you think about vehicle to grid, if you were to take those vehicles and have those vehicles have the ability to serve as battery storage, as backup power, well, they can charge the other half, and those consumers that have flexible tariffs can recharge when no one else is using electricity in the middle of the night. And Ontario is already long on power anyways. Right? Flexible tariff structures, flexible technology to allow those vehicles to feed back to the grid. It's not possible with the current technology, at least not on a deployed scale. And it's probably 10, 15 years down the road. But these are kind of the challenges that, when you think about the challenges of today, none of these challenges are on, or few of the challenges are on, really just the power plants themselves. People know how to build power plants. They know how to build a gas facility. They know how to build a coal facility. But people haven't really wrapped their head around how to build up a grid that sustains the developments we're seeing right now. And I think that's where energy storage can come in as well. And I'm going to use a German phrase that's going to be probably very amusing to most, and Professor Klein might appreciate the eierlegende Wollmilchsau. It's the egg-laying wool milk pick, which means it's the jack of all trades. It's something that can do a whole lot of things. Energy storage can absorb electricity that is not needed. It can serve as load. It can dispatch it again. It can serve as frequency regulation. It can be relieve transmission congestion. It can be demand response. It can do a whole lot of things. So energy storage is promising to solve a problem that, or many, many different problems, and there's many different value propositions to energy storage that haven't necessarily been explored to many degrees, that definitely haven't been addressed by regulation, and that are probably maybe still 10 years away from being economical. But the potential of storage is that it can not only generate electricity, it can't generate itself, but it can dispatch back to the grid once it's been charged. It can also solve all these other issues that potentially are plaguing the grid at the moment. So I think I'm just about at my time, so I wanted to, thanks very much, and if you have questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you. Stephen.
Hi all, thank you for having me. Appreciate being here. I also graduated in 2012, and so got to share a lot of classes with the individuals up here. And similar to a lot of Sci students, I had a background that was in a different field for the most part. I did economic analysis at an international trade law firm and decided to switch my career a little bit. Also, it didn't help that I was in an economics PhD program that I flunked out of and decided to try and do something a little different. And the appeal to SICE that the econ program didn't have was that it was practical, that it was based in real world experience. And one of the tricks that I got to learn was that the value of the SICE education is that kind of macro perspective of issues. And so, like Alfie, I actually got into the energy field by doing an internship at OPIC as well, which I didn't know anything about before then, and joined the ERE program, which fortunately Debbie let me in a year late, as long as I did more classes, and got through that. I currently have a company called Near Northeast, and it is not to be confused with the Northeast Group. And if you ever meet the owners of the Northeast Group, apologize. It was a pure coincidence on names. So I hope they don't think that I was trying to play off of their fame and success. I started this company about 4 years ago just to do consulting for myself. About 2 years ago, I started to expand it and ended up hiring people. We now have 7 consultants working in a variety of different fields. For the most part, I started Near Northeast as a specialized finance consulting firm, and that's because of the experience I got with OPIC in project finance. I wanted to focus on project finance and infrastructure on the consulting side. That's expanded now a bit to project finance, M&A, a bit of public bond issuances, and monoline insurance products for some of those issuances. So we've expanded, but it's still kind of specialized finance. Like I mentioned, we have 7 people now that work across a variety of engagements. Most of these engagements are with the public sector. My largest client is still OPIC, but includes also USAID and USTDA. And then we also have a private sector side working with private sector developers and young startups that are seeking financing as well. And that's been just a really exciting thing to work on. I got, I would say, bit by the entrepreneur bug about 5 years ago and wanted to really think what could I do in that space. And so that's how I ended up into this field. And the other way that I ended up there was the same reason that I ended up liking project finance from like an OPIC perspective. And that's because I really enjoy thinking about difficult issues and how they can be tractable, how they're puzzles that you can solve. And that's really project finance in a nutshell as well. That effectively with project finance, you are de-risking a transaction, applying the most appropriate party to take on that specific risk. And you do that by assigning parties to, like I mentioned, take on the risk that they can actually withstand. And that could be financially, that could be from a capabilities standpoint, and it's almost like a puzzle that ends up having lots of different pieces. And so thinking about how I can do that in a broader sense, that's what brought me to the consulting field, because that really is what consulting is. And the other thing that I've discovered with consulting is that not only are there puzzles that you have to solve, sometimes you have to tell the client what that puzzle is that they need to solve, because they don't understand that either. And I think that's particularly relevant in the energy and infrastructure space. One of the issues that's very important to me that I work on with a lot of the public sector clients is dealing with energy poverty. And I know it wasn't specifically named as the issue, but in terms of rural electrification and everything else that you guys do, I know that you're dealing with this. And so I don't need to tell you the headlines of, 1 billion people over 1 billion people without access to electricity, and another billion on top of that have unreliable access. And so this was an issue that became important to me. And I realized, well, there are all these specialists in the field. There are DFIs that are looking at financing. There are NGOs that are looking at specific environmental issues, but they're all trying to approach the same thing. And what they need to do is they need to focus on what the challenges of energy poverty are. And I think that you guys probably know this a lot better than I do anyway, but just to go over them, these are government policy challenges. These are capabilities to pay. These are technology constraints, capacity building exercises, and investment capital. really, if you can solve those challenges, then you can help solve energy poverty to a large degree. And is that going to be easy? No. Are there people focused on that? Yes. And is it making a difference? No, unfortunately not. You take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and right now you're looking at roughly 600 million people without any access to electricity. And there is a lot of activity, some of which I'm working on through Power Africa Initiative and other DFIs that are working on. And with all this activity, in the next 10 years, they still expect 500 million people with no access. So all you're making a difference for is for 100 million of that select population. Why is that the case? And that gets to thinking about these issues on a broader sense, that you can't just approach the financing of projects alone, the ability to develop the projects. And I think that's hard from your position as a student saying, well, what can I go get a job in after this? And particularly, what can I go get a job in when there's such specialized focus of these developers, of these agencies working in this field? Do I need to be an engineer to work on the technology side? No, not necessarily. Do I need to be a lawyer because these are all, heavily structured transactions that are all based on legal precedent in the country that you have to know about, plus contracts on top of it for EPC arrangements or O&M arrangements? No, you don't have to be a lawyer. Do I need to be a financial modeler alone because I see all these banks use financial modelers that have come out of the investment banking world? And the answer to that is yes, you do need to know that one, but you don't need to do that alone. And that's really the value to me of what the SICE education was about, is to be able to take that macro perspective and approach some of these intractable issues. From a consulting standpoint, and because I'm trying to develop my own practice and have been reaching out to clients, I've found that to be a particularly great hook that they appreciate. That when I enter into a consulting agreement, I do bring in specialists in these certain areas, but I work with a lot of SICE graduates who have kind of a broader education background, and like I said, can not only solve the puzzle for the client, but tell them what the puzzle was in the first place and how it's a broader issue to what they thought that they just needed to work on. And so I think that's a real strong value add that both clients appreciate and, future employers as well. So I would definitely encourage you to keep that in mind as you go out in the field. And so I'll stop there for now. Happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move into questions and answers, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first one. I think this is really a big issue. I'm sure this isn't the first time you've heard this question, but it's a big issue for graduating students graduating now, and that is the Trump effect. And so how do you see your business changing in particular? Has it changed? And do you see the potential of employment in your firms changing as a result of the Trump effect? So I'll start with Natalia and we'll go down the line. It's already on.
Oh. I would say for us, yes, we have been feeling the changes because we primarily work with the federal government on a lot of federal credit programs. So for us, these changes, to some extent, a lot of the agencies didn't even know what the changes would be for a long time. So they were preemptively making changes because they were anticipating doing less in renewable energy and infrastructure. So I would say that as a small company, the skill capital is only 7 or 8 people. Archetype is a larger company, but for us, focusing on the federal clients, we are thinking about diversifying our scope and our clientele. The company used to be split between private and public sector, but in the last decade, there have just been a lot of great opportunities with the Loan Programs Office, Department of Defense, doing renewable energy with them. So we kind of just were focused on one sector, and we're realizing that we need to engage more with local governments, municipalities, and seek out those clients because they will be doing more work than federal programs. Federal programs won't have as much pull in terms of financing. So I guess our target would be looking to states and municipalities to help them finance large projects. And in terms of hiring and kind of the company's future, it's hard to tell. We are going through some changes now internally, so I would say we would need to set our strategy, which just started shifting first before we could probably take on new people. So I would say maybe an intern here and there, but I don't see us taking on new associates or managers in the short term. But yes, we are feeling the changes.
Alfie,
So,
you're dealing with a much bigger company, so.
yeah, I think that's
more
what I wanted
diversified.
to say. I think, it's all about perspective and where you sit. At Deloitte, we really prize versatility in our employees. So you need to be able to respond quickly to the changing situation, especially in the federal space. So I think people were surprised when President Trump won, but it wasn't sort of a shell shock. It was more of a, wow, that happened. All right, how do we adjust? And we were well positioned to start making some phone calls and to start making some changes in terms of how we approach different clients and a variety of different opportunities. I will say that some of the existing contract vehicles with the federal government consulting, they're longer term. So there really wasn't a lot of uncertainty that, are they going to pull the plug on one of these contracts and are we all going to have to go home? It was more of, if you had 2 or 3 years left on the contract, you're probably safe. How do you start thinking about after that a little bit differently? There were some changes with any administration. We saw a lot of clean power program work or renewable power initiatives with the Obama administration. Some of the, this is at least for USAID especially, some of the follow-on work to that was still called the clean, clean energy IDIQ or clean power initiatives. But really what you saw was sort of like a slight variation on that. So instead of solar and wind being the 90% of the focus, that was still part of it, but there was additional attention paid to natural gas or LNG or energy efficiency. And I think really what you just saw was a sort of a tweak because a lot of the people that end up putting out these programs are, they work in these institutions for the long term. So they're there for 30 years, and really they've got their own sort of sense of how they do things. And yeah, there's influence by the executive branch the White House, but they've got some power to push back on too. In terms of how Deloitte is handling the current administration, we're still hiring, we're still busy. Especially on the infrastructure space, where our team is growing a lot. We've got a lot of interesting work from a financial modeling and due diligence perspective. A lot of energy work as well, power, gas, transmission especially. We're seeing a lot of interest in transmission work, and that's one area where we've been particularly light on, just because I think transmission projects generally are expensive. They take a long time to develop. There's not a lot of dynamism in the market in terms of who does it. There's 4 or 5 big companies and maybe even less. So we're seeing pockets of demand, and thankfully Deloitte's able to sort of adjust and take that market signal and act on it fairly quickly. And there's a lot of people at SAIS that work at Deloitte on my team and teams that I work closely with. So I'd encourage you all to reach out to them, and they're on LinkedIn, and you can come up to me and I can put you in touch as well.
Great, thank you. Nikolai?
So for my specific business line, the effect hasn't been.
Can
Yeah,
you?
yeah. Can you guys hear me now? Yeah. Yeah, for my particular business line, the effect hasn't been very strong because we don't have any federal clients, or just very few. So there's no impact on our work. At my company as a whole, I have no idea because we do have some public consulting teams that are in different spaces like economics and automotive and so forth. But I'm sure most of the things that Alfie and Dalia said that have happened there as well. In terms of how we have dealt with this administration and the products we do, certainly the analysis has shifted somewhat, and we just, again, Pride ourselves on being able to take anything and analyze it in depth. So we've done that. Certainly the folks who cover the Clean Power Plan have found different applications within the company. They're not doing those things anymore. As I mentioned when I was up to the podium, again, we are our energy business is a slow-growing, saturated space. So there is never a ton of hiring happening, even more so the last few years. We just hired somebody, but that person was laid off from an oil and gas producing company who is very senior. So right now is an opportune time to hire for talent, and maybe for people who don't have much experience, but somewhere in the middle will be tough to come in. But things change quickly. If new products take on and they need the horsepower to move them forward, we'll definitely look for opportunity for new talent. And IHS Markit is pretty good about the website. Everything that's posted there is real. There is no, let's just post it there and see if there's interest in hire 2 years from now. It's whatever is available is there.
Felix.
Kind of steal your microphone because mine's up. So working on environmental regulation, I can say yes, there was an effect. For us, it was probably, for my team specifically, I think the stay of the Clean Power Plan by the Supreme Court, and I think it was February 2016, was probably more of an impact than the actual election. Because the Clean Power Plan was essentially stopped in its tracks completely at that point. So that's when we felt some of the activity around planning for the Clean Power Plan drying up a little bit. When President Trump got elected, I feel everyone was kind of taking a deep breath, right? All right, this happened. Let's figure out how to move on. So when you think about M&A activity in the power space in the month of December 2016, probably not as big as it was the year before, right? Everyone was kind of taking stock of what's going to happen, and then restarting their efforts a couple of months later. On the otherwise, generally, since my teams are focused on the commercial side, all right, I wouldn't say the impact has been huge, right? We still work on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We still work with state and local actors. I think that's something that's been more and more the case, as was mentioned, right? When you think about states putting out offshore wind mandates, storage mandates, that activity has definitely accelerated. Of course, when you think about our teams that are on the sort of working with Department of Energy, for example, we administer the Energy Star program and the Better Buildings Challenge at DOE, right? Those are all programs that could potentially face some funding challenges with the new administration. So they are certainly more concerned, I would say. On the commercial side, right, if you advise M&A projects, if you advise state and local actors, if you think about NGOs and think tanks, most of them have been flooded with donations and are trying to figure out what to do with those. So there is activity in that space, helping people do advocacy work, trying to model through challenges, trying to help people understand what is going on in the power sector. So the impact has been there. We're working on different things. It's not been catastrophic, I would say, by any means. And the general strategy on the commercial side, I don't think has changed. I think the diversification of our services is something that every company working in a public and competitive space is trying to achieve, and we're no exception to that theory. Very active in the sort of distributed energy resources space, helping utilities, state actors figure out how a utility of the future would have to look like to accommodate electric vehicles, community solar, behind-the-meter activities and investments. So those are all activities that are still very much ongoing.
Like I mentioned, I used to work at a law firm before SICE, and one of the things that they talked about when they built up their practice was we have attorneys that work in M&A, and then we have attorneys that work in bankruptcy, so we can cover the whole end of the economic cycle. And the thing you realize is that if you are, let's call it a generalist, you can really wave out any kind of cycles. And having an interest in finance and finance of energy infrastructure, I've definitely seen that to be the case with the election. And in fact, a lot of my business has boomed since Trump got elected because with the private sector side, there's a rebalancing of their capital. They're trying to deploy it into long-term assets that will protect them. And I think the new tax bill is actually going to affect that even more because there's a lot of money being pulled out of some of these municipal bonds that these family offices that I've been working with are trading. And so it's been great for business. But in terms of being able to work on the things that I care about, like renewable energy and energy poverty, that's also been just a rebalance as well. When Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, I started to see a lot of activity with my colleagues that brought me in on some contracts for states and municipalities to really think about how they're going to meet certain targets that they're setting for themselves. I saw a lot more activity from some of the international organizations to pick up the slack, so to say, for the Americans on that agreement. That particularly came from DFID. And so it really does happen that you sit through an economic cycle or even a cycle of specific issues that are of interest, then you'll find the other players that are interested. And so I would say that it definitely has a strong impact, and it would particularly have an impact on the regulatory side, as Felix was mentioning. But for those of you interested in energy and infrastructure finance in particular, there's always going to be people looking to deploy their capital, and it just may come in different sources from the public side to the private side.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take some questions now.
Hi, my name is Jacob Lee. I'm first year ERE concentrators. My questions are about challenges. So working in project finance areas, what are the challenges you may have faced? I mean, it could be your personal challenges, it could be structural challenges. I mean, it'd be appreciated if you can share those challenges. Thank you very much.
Want me to go? I think that's a really good question. I'm smiling because there's always challenges in project finance. It's sort of like a synonym for it, maybe, but all in a good way. And I think, as Stephen said, like it's about solving those challenges that help bring a project over the line, and they're going to be different in the various life cycle stages of the project. For example, when it's still a greenfield, early stage project, your challenge could be securing the right to the land, or it could be getting the equity investment needed to start going out and doing some initial studies. And once you solve that challenge, then the next one could be negotiating terms with an EPC provider that the banks are going to be comfortable with, or with your off-taker that that you can get financing for. When it comes to the banks, it's going to be they're charging you too much for their money. How do you get them to lower that? And then when it's in construction, you never know. I mean, I worked on a project, Bayonne power plant in New Jersey, and it was right before Sandy. It was in the middle of construction, and it went through force majeure. And people that I was working with had spent their whole years in project finance, had never had a force majeure event. So that was pretty cool to see. And then in operations, something could break down, and your debt reserve wasn't enough, and nobody foresaw that. So you have to figure out a way around that. And then in decommissioning, you could, the cost could go above what you expected. So, it's a long-winded way of saying that there's going to be challenges in every stage, and they're going to be unique, and it's more your preparation to how you overcome those challenges that I think make a successful transaction.
Good. Next question.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a second-year international development student, and I'm taking this semester a class on infrastructure modeling and finance, but I have no other experience in modeling. And so I just wanted to get your advice on how to break into that industry, especially with a science degree and with no former work experience in the banking sector or any other finance company.
Yes. Go
I could take this. I feel like I came from a background before SAIS that was not quantitative at all, and so it was like a crash course for 2 years at SAIS. But you keep on learning on your first job. Coming on entry level, no one will expect you to know everything. So just just taking these courses and being familiar with the terminology and just knowing the shortcuts in Excel is helpful. But I found that on the job at PFC Energy, where I started, there's just a lot of training. People are willing to help, and no one will let you, trail behind. So just keep doing what you're doing, and it's an evolving and learning process. You never stop learning. I'm still discovering new things in Excel that I get really excited about.
So I came to SAIS without work experience and with the very relevant background of cancer biology. And I ended up getting my first job in electricity modeling. I still don't quite know how that happened. No, it was SAIS, I can tell you that much. But no, yeah, as it was mentioned, you're not going to be expected to know the models coming in, right? Either companies have proprietary models that you have no way of knowing, or they go into licensed models that you cannot possibly pay for as a student. It's important to have the skills necessary to operate the models, right? You have to have understanding of how a database functions. You have to have understanding of what you do when you're faced with an Excel spreadsheet that has about, 60 columns and 300,000 lines of data, and what to do with that. And those are things you can learn, and those are things that if you, for example, take project finance, you'll be thrown into very quickly. So having, and then the markets background, right? If I'm looking at resumes and recruiting, I'm looking at, okay, has this person done anything with data sets, databases? Has this person done something with markets, exposure to the topic? Ideally, some experience on through internships in the area, right? So, don't try to get too freaked out by the sense that you don't know exactly what it is you're going to be doing in that job. I don't think anybody knew exactly what they were going to be doing on that job and have come in with that experience. Right? Then you're doing a job that someone else should, like, you're there to learn the job as well, I would say.
Could I just add, this is something I tell my students all the time. The default position is often that we need an MBA or an engineer. You run into that, and sometimes an economist. The advantage that you guys have is that sectoral broad experience that Stephen would have. And again, exemplified by, I was talking to somebody who's in the power business, and I was asking him if he had been involved in the Puerto Rico remediation, and his reaction was, I have a group of folks working for me who are all engineers. They can't do economic analysis, and they can't write. So I can't write a proposal. And that's precisely the way, instead of looking at what you don't have, looking at what you do have and selling that is very important. Okay, next question. You wanted
Just
to
as
say?
an example to that, if we're working on a project, or most projects that we do, we provide energy and capacity price forecasts, right? Sounds super sophisticated. In the end, it's a simple econ 1 supply and demand diagram. Right? There's more that goes into it, of course, right? But if you know economic fundamentals and you're going to also take intermediate economics, right? You know what a supply and demand diagram looks like. You might already know what it looks like in the power sector if you've taken some of the infrastructure classes. So you're already probably ways ahead of every engineer that's going to work in your company, right? And as Stephen mentioned, right, you don't need to be an engineer, you don't need to be a lawyer, you don't need to be an economist, but if you're a SAISer, you're kind of already halfway there.
Another question?
Yeah. As far as I know that...
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Zhi Yangling. I'm a first-year ERE concentrator, and as far as I know, there's a pilot project in Brooklyn about electricity markets at Brooklyn. I'm thinking about how does recently popular blockchain affect your strategy on deploy infrastructure or is blockchain still too far for energy industry, or is close? Yeah, thank you.
I can take a first stab, but
I don't know much about the subject, so I'll defer to my colleagues there. But when I joined Deloitte about a year and 6 months ago, there wasn't any discussion about blockchain. 3 months in, all of a sudden it's all in my inbox. Everybody's talking about blockchain from a power and utilities perspective, but also from oil and gas pipelines, Internet of Things. So I think there's a lot of interest there, and there's a lot of attention and funding and focus going towards understanding it, at least from a consulting perspective. What little I do know is that if you combine blockchain with distributed generation, with energy storage, you have this model that Felix was talking about that could be the future and solve a lot of challenges. So I think the potential is really high. I think there's not a lot of people that know a lot about it, quite frankly. And I think if you have an interest in it, that could be a differentiator, in a recruitment process. But like I said, I don't work very closely with it. It's just been on a lot of people's radars.
I have a client that recently we started working with who's really interested in blockchain for their investment transparency purposes, so their portfolio and monitoring. That basically they want to work with some of the infrastructure funds that are investing in these energy assets to be able to better monitor usage, consumer behavior, and any other metrics that they can pull simply from a point-to-point basis. And so they're really interested in it from a transparency purposes. For transparency purposes, apparently there are a couple of the international finance institutions, mainly in Europe, that are developing tools to be able to do that. KfW has one that we're integrating into the system with this client, and so people are really interested, and I think it's very valuable from an energy perspective, particularly for transparency and portfolio monitoring purposes, but there are myriad other capabilities that can be used for as well.
And I think sort of one thing that I would mention is that goes along with sort of the idea of blockchain is just the integrity of data and what you can do with data is changing, right? So the data oftentimes used to exist, or the knowledge wasn't really disseminated very far, and people didn't really know what to use the data for, right? So if you think about a utility, they knew all about their assets, the generation assets, the transmission assets, but they didn't necessarily understand very much about their consumer, and that's changing. And you have a lot more data at your hands, and you almost don't know what to do with all of it. I think that when I started at SAIS, and even before then, I think anytime you looked at a topic, you were like, oh, how do I find data on this subject? Right now, it's more about how do I find the good data on the subject, and what do I actually do with it? I think that's something that the big data blockchain movement is going to help to facilitate, is that people can actually use what they're getting the data for and actually turn that into sort of something actionable, right? So everyone talks about blockchain, very few people know a lot about it, and probably even fewer have done something very tangible with it, right? So the door is just opening there to what can actually be done with it.
Okay. Wait, no. Introduce yourself.
I will introduce myself. Hi, I'm Gabe Gordon Harper, also an Erie student, as many of us are. President of the Energy Club as well, for what it matters. Question for you all. I think all of you mentioned your interest in renewables, which is not surprising given SAIS's curriculum and the times. And all of you now work for consulting. And some of you to varying degrees have had challenges, it sounds like, working directly or haven't ended up working directly on renewables. So I'm curious if any of you also considered working for a solar developer, wind developer, storage company like Tesla AES, and kind of how you all ended up in the consulting side of that story. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Oh, and also you mentioned in kind of the same light, interest in international, which makes sense from where you're from, and many of you ended up in North America, so kind of similar question, wondering how, if it's harder to kind of get into the international world as a energy person in the States, or kind of, what the story is there. So why consulting instead of renewable developing, and how did it happen that so many of you ended up in North America when you're interested in international?
I could start. So why consulting versus development? I think the SAIS curriculum caters more to the consulting side of things, where you can bring in various disciplines. Correct me if I'm wrong, my panel, but to go to work for a developer, you probably would need to have more of a pure finance expertise. And so a lot of my classmates have gone from consulting into getting into that route through consulting. So you just get more exposure to those clients and those projects through consulting, and then you can jump into working for a developer. So some of my classmates work for Tesla now and for Google doing exactly that. So some of the projects that I was working on in the loan programs office, those were the clients, or sorry, the borrowers. And then domestic versus international, the federal government is seated here, so there's just a lot of federal government activity. I guess it's just luck and what is open when you're looking for a job and where the openings are. I ended up working in North America, downstream oil. That's where the job opening was. And it was a very reputable energy consulting company around the block from SAIS. So, it's just, it's so hard as a student to know what the strategy is for applying for jobs, and just doing a lot of networking and informational interviews. The earlier you can is the better. I always found ways to work on international projects, so I just asked for it a lot. And when there was an opportunity, I was given those opportunities. So even now, with the federal government as their main clientele, I am pursuing like international projects and developing our business practice in that direction. So you could combine it all, I guess. Yeah.
I would agree. And I think for me, I guess when I was at SAIS my last year, I was pursuing jobs at AES, in New York at a bank, in the federal government, and I just sort of casted a pretty wide net. And I knew that I wanted to work in infrastructure. I knew that I wanted to work in project finance, and I knew that I wanted to work in international environments, right? And I took a job working in New York in North America, power and gas finance, right? So I couldn't check all the columns, but it was enough for me to say, okay, this is it's getting me there. It's one step there. And I think that's a key thing to remember. Our careers are going to be really long. And there's a lot of dynamism in the market. You can move around. Like, I've had 3 jobs since I left SAIS, and every single one of them has been an incremental step to something that I really feel like is a great fit. As a banker, you work long hours. Your head's in the model. It's just a different work environment than if you're a developer. You're dealing with more headaches that are earlier stage, but you actually have more of a say in like what you're actually building. And as a consultant, you kind of get to touch a little bit of everything, which is nice. So there's different perspectives. They're going to be valued by you at different times in your career, more or less. I think the key is not to get hung up on finding the perfect job right out of SAIS, but finding a job that is getting you one step closer. And then, like for example, if you're working in North America, as Natalia said, and they have an opportunity that's international, you're the one that has the degree in international studies. Like, you're the natural choice to go do that, and vice versa. So just keep an open mind, and I think any step forward is a step in the right direction.
I think for me, especially coming in with little to no work experience after SAIS, the diversity is something that consulting is great for, right? Because I don't think I've worked on a project that was exactly like the previous project in the 3 years that I've been at ICF, right? There's always something completely new. The international experience for me, and be careful what you wish for, suddenly you're moving to Canada for a year. But essentially there's a great amount of diversity. You can, renewables, natural gas, coal, carbon markets, gas markets. I've worked on all these different issues. I've worked on Mexico and Canada and the US. And And that's something that I think, going into a developer role is something that where you're more targeted, right? You have a more, I think, defined role within that process. And not having been at a developer, I might speak a little out of line here, but I think that's sort of the focus versus the diversity that's playing an important role in sort of helping you also determine what it is that you like. And I think the majority of graduates within the first 3 to 5, 1 to 3 years even, switch jobs. I think that's fair to say. If I look around my class, I'm one of the few that's actually been at one job for 3. That's not a good or a bad thing, right? It allows you to take a first step, and then you figure out what you like, what you don't like, and you take steps from there, right? And I happen to have been lucky to find what I still like very much right now, but that doesn't mean that I'm still going to be there the next year, right? Whenever you progress, what you like changes.
Yeah, I guess everything that people have said is true. For me, I had done a mix of research and consulting before SAI, so I knew what kind of to expect from my job, and I liked what I was doing back then. So, not the theme of it, but more like the nature of the work. So, I'm happy where I am right now. And to escape, to be stuck into North America, there is a lot to learn on the North American market. I'm still learning 7 years after I started my current position. It's just the gas market here is super complicated, and that's what's keeping me interested in the job.
Stephen, you're a little bit different, and there's a tremendous interest, Gabe, you didn't say that, of starting your own businesses too. So can you kind of talk about the path that led you to start your own business?
No, happy to. Well, I'll first say that you couldn't pay me enough to work for a solar developer right now. There's no margin in the business. You look at 4 cents a kilowatt hour auctions happening. Where they're not making any money at all. It's all downside. So I'll throw that out there right now. If you're interested in working for a developer, though, there's definitely interesting experience that goes behind it. But you have to think about the market dynamics behind the specific industry to be able to do it. In terms of starting my own business, like I said before, I just kind of got bit by the entrepreneurial bug to do something different and on my own. And I think part of that was recognizing that I personally don't have all the capabilities that I wanted to be able to do some of the engagements that I was looking at signing up. And in fact, I needed to build a practice with other people, some of whom have specializations, some of them are more generalist and jack of all trade type folks. And that got me more of the interesting type of transactions, the interesting type of contracts that I was interested in, because they were the larger, more intractable issues. Again, my focus has never been that I can just focus on one thing like financial modeling, or focus on one thing like a specific engineering situation with a technology that we're working with. I like to think about it in more broad strokes, and that's definitely consulting, and that's definitely sometimes working on your own. I would say that starting my own firm and doing what I'm doing now, I have 7 people under, is no different than what these guys are doing as consultants as well. Really what you find are there large firms and small firms in consultancies, and in the large firms, people have their own pods, and in the small firms, it's basically like a pod without the large firm. So it's all pretty similar work, but it has been fun to try and do it on my own. It's been nerve-wracking, and it's been you get a different set of skills that you wouldn't have thought that you would have had before. For example, I'm now somewhat of an expert on federal acquisition procedures, which you wouldn't find normally if you're trying to get into energy infrastructure transactions or finance. But the FAR is the rule book for federal contracts, and so as a head of a firm, you have to know that. You have to know about insurance to be able to insure all your workers, et cetera. So it's been a bit of a growing pain from that perspective, but it's been a lot of fun too.
Okay, great. Yeah.
You've made the argument that size was useful. Looking back, what would it be nice to have on top of what you have? What was not there that you could offer?
There were courses that started after we actually graduated, the basics course.
Yeah,
that
the
would have been very
fundamentals.
helpful.
Yeah.
Fundamentals, yeah. That I felt was absolutely necessary. And you guys are enjoying that now. That's great.
It went through a lot of growing pains before.
Sure, but it wasn't there at all when I was there.
No, I know.
I think fundamentals would have been good. I spent a lot of time
doing that research on my own. And I think this is, I mean, more indicative of where my career went, not necessarily what I think SICE needs or doesn't need, but I could have used more emphasis on just sort of general accounting and like analyzing financial statements, understanding some of the commercial issues that go with energy. I think there's a large focus on economics, which I think is important, but there's a commercial aspect to economics in the market that I think I didn't get as much of.
I actually, some of those skills that maybe are not part of the program, but as an alumna, I've taken advantage of the career services courses that are on the weekends, or they're offered kind of sporadically through the year, and alumni can come to those. So if you feel like there's a skill that you still don't have down, you could always come back to take a course like that, and they're heavily discounted for alumni. Yeah, but I think I would agree the fundamentals thing. I really enjoyed the Erie practicum. Thought that was a really valuable experience. So I hope that keeps going.
Right, and I think there's definitely, and I've noticed that when I was here, that there's sort of a move towards offering more practical, sort of direct job-related skills courses taught by practitioners. So when, as was mentioned, you're not going to have the engineer write a proposal. Since I'm not an engineer, I'm now writing a lot of proposals. And I didn't write one before when coming to my previous job and coming out of SICE. So there's different elements to understanding the markets. Well, you need to just define the market that you're looking at, right? But on the other hand, there's practical skills that SICE teaches. The quantitative analysis, the statistics, working with the Harvard Business School courses that I took on statistics because I didn't have it in my space for my curriculum, but still could allow it to do that on my own time. And sort of building those practical skills that are going to be used are going to set you apart in the job, because everyone's going to come in with some sort of educational background, right? But if your educational background already includes a lot of the practical things you'll end up doing in your job, there's another leg up you have over your competition.
When I was here, the finance folks went on these career treks up to New York and met with all of those jerks at the bulge bracket banks. And would come
You
back
guys never met with me.
Yeah, talking about Alfie as well. And it was a little discouraging. I understand now, because I see the emails that you guys are doing actually ERE-related career treks as well, and I think that's a great idea because you are meeting with these developers, you are meeting with regulators and other people in the field, and I'm glad that you guys are building that out.
Okay, so we're right at time. I'm hoping you guys will stay around and answer some one-on-one questions. I understand Jonelle have some snacks in the room next door. Yes?
That's correct. So, thank you all very, very much. And let's now send some refreshments on the side so we will have a clear time to be able to meet with us individually and answer questions or anything.
Thank you.